For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 781, I call up House Concurrent Resolution 83 and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the title of the concurrent resolution.
House Concurrent Resolution 83, concurrent resolution directing the President, pursuant to Section 5C of the War Powers Resolution, to terminate the use of United States Armed Forces to engage in hostilities in or against Iran.
Pursuant to House Resolution 781, the amendment printed in the House Report 116-371 is adopted, and the concurrent resolution as amended is considered read. The concurrent resolution as amended shall be debatable for 2 hours, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, and the gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, each will control 1 hour. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on House Concurrent Resolution 83 under consideration.
Without objection.
I yield myself as much
The
time as I
gentleman
may
will suspend.
consume.
The House will be in order. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I yield myself as much time as I may consume. And we're here this afternoon so that this body can exercise one of its most important constitutional responsibilities, deciding on whether or not this country will wage war, whether or not we'll check an executive that has brought our country to a dangerous brink. In recent months, tensions between the United States and Iran have ticked up bit by bit until this last week, when we found ourselves in a crisis like we haven't seen in decades. Let's be clear. The Iranians are responsible for their own harmful behavior. We know this is a regime that underwrites terrorism. May I ask for the House is not in order?
The gentleman's correct. The House is not in order. Please take your conversations off the floor. The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So let's be clear. The Iranians are responsible for their own harmful behavior. We know this is a regime that underwrites terrorism, that tries to strengthen its own position by fomenting instability and provocation. We know that about Iran. No one expects Iran to be the adult in the room when it comes to global affairs. What we do expect is that American leadership and American policy will be the moderating force. So the world was stunned last week when the Trump administration chose instead the path towards escalation with the killing of Qasem Soleimani. We need to be honest about Soleimani. He was a bad guy. He had masterminded attacks and campaigns that cost thousands of innocent lives. In the places where we've seen Iran's most harmful activity, Soleimani's fingerprints were everywhere. He had American blood on his hands, and the world is better off without him. But are we really safer today, as the administration claims, with American citizens told to get out of Iraq as fast as they can, thousands of troops deploying to the Middle East, an eviction notice from the Iraqi government, whose partnership we depend on in the fight against ISIS, Iranian missiles endangering American personnel? It certainly doesn't feel like we're safer, and a poll out today shows that the American people agree. In foreign policy, you have to weigh decisions like this. As awful as Soleimani was, this action has endangered American lives and American security. The President and his advisors say they had no choice, that there was an imminent threat. Then they said, well, he had done bad things in the past and was going to do more bad things in the future. When they sent a report on the strike to Congress, the administration took the highly unusual step of classifying it. And then yesterday, in a classified briefing, when members demanded to see the evidence that justified the strike, the message from the administration essentially boiled down to this: trust us. When we asked what's the plan going forward, the administration essentially told members, trust us. Trust us is not good enough, Mr. Speaker. Not for me and not for the American people. Madam Speaker, if they're going to send our men and women in uniform into harm's way, they shouldn't hide the facts. First of all, this administration hasn't given us any reason to believe that this is a fact. The foreign policy of this administration has undermined American leadership, cut our diplomats off at the knees, alienated our allies, and walked away from our obligations. We've lurched from crisis to crisis, each time hoping that the situation won't spin out of control. I call it fly by the seat of your pants foreign policy, and it's no way to advance American interests and values on the global stage. But beyond that, beyond the way this administration has acted, it's not the job of Congress to give any administration its blind trust. It's why we have separation of powers. It's why the Constitution entrusts war powers to Congress. Let me say that again. It's why the Constitution entrusts war powers to Congress. We haven't had a declared war in this country since World War II. It's not the way it should happen. So it's a relief that both the administration and the Iranians have, for the moment, opted to de-escalate. But we'd be foolish to think this crisis is over. It could flame up again in the blink of an eye, and I worry that another misstep on either side could be what plunges our country into another ill-advised war in the Middle East. I'll say it very plainly. The American people do not want war with Iran. With the measure before us today, we are denying the President the authority to wage such a war. This would direct the President to terminate the use of armed force against Iran without congressional authorization unless it's necessary to respond to an imminent armed attack against the United States. The President always has the power to defend America. No one denies that. This resolution explicitly preserves this right, but that's a limited exception. The President shouldn't abuse it. Now, we've heard the argument that the 2002 authorization for the use of military force, the Iraq War authorization, would justify military action against Iran. That's just wrong. It's not what Congress intended when it passed that resolution. I was here. I remember it. It should be repealed, not used to launch more military action. If the President wants to use military force against Iran, he has to come to Congress. Any president has to come to Congress. We're not making rules only for this president. We're making rules for the president, any president, vis-a-vis Congress's constitutional powers. The president has to make the case first, not after he launches an ill-advised attack, then after the fact comes up with a reason why it was necessary and why it was legal. That's not the way our system works. Today, I've heard the myth floating around that this resolution is non-binding, that it's just symbolic. So let me quote from the War Powers Act to prove that untrue. The War Powers Law says, and I quote, "At any time that the United States Armed Forces are engaged in hostilities outside the territory of the United States, its possessions and territories, without a declaration of war or specific statutory authorization, such forces shall be removed by the President if the Congress so directs by concurrent resolution." Again, by concurrent resolution. That's what the War Powers Act states that we need to do. That's what we're doing today. This is the House of Representatives exercising its Article I authority. We don't get authority. No, I will not yield. I'm making my opening statement perhaps later if there's time. We don't get authority over war powers just because if the President says so. We get authority over war powers, period. That's our authority. So let's put that fiction to rest. And one final point, Madam Speaker, about the tone of this debate. Yesterday, a member of this body went on television and said, and I quote, that Democrats, quote, are in love with terrorists. They mourn Soleimani more than they mourn our Gold Star families, unquote. Another member labeled a group of colleagues Ayatollah sympathizers. At a time when we're talking about policy that will have direct bearing on American men and women, service members and diplomats in harm's way, comments like that reflect very poorly on this body, and I remind the House that all members, in both parties, regardless of party, love this country. These words have no place in this debate. On the Foreign Affairs Committee, we take pride in debating issues, even the toughest issues, on the merits and on the facts. I salute my friend, the ranking member, Mr. McCall, for working so closely with me to make sure we do so. That's one of the keys of the Foreign Affairs Committee. I strongly encourage all members on both sides to bear that in mind during this debate. We all take the same oath. We can argue about this resolution without questioning one another's motives or one another's patriotism. I thank you, Madam Speaker, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in opposition to House Concurrent Resolution 83. When President Obama took down Osama bin Laden, the Republican members joined with Democrats as Americans to praise the president. Unfortunately, today, Democrats are incapable of giving this president credit where credit is due, which only emboldens Iran. I'm surprised to be faced with this partisan resolution today. We should be standing together, as the chairman mentioned, as a nation. Instead, this resolution plays politics with national security. Yesterday, the president laid out a measured response to Iran's ballistic missile attacks. Let me be clear, the president is not seeking war with Iran. The president has shown, if anything, great restraint regarding Iran, including after Iran's downing of a U.S. drone, a U.S. military asset. But in their blind contempt for the president, my colleagues are ignoring the assessments of career intelligence and military professionals. Our colleagues on the other side are downplaying the murderous evil of Soleimani, the mastermind of terror in the Middle East for over 2 decades. Soleimani was designated as a terrorist by the Obama administration. He was responsible for the deaths of more than 600 Americans and wounded thousands more. Soleimani was involved in the Iranian plot to assassinate the Saudi ambassador to the United States on American soil in Georgetown, right in this city. Soleimani oversaw Iran's support for Assad in Syria, including convincing Russia to fight for Assad, killing hundreds of thousands. This year, Soleimani played a key role in the crackdown on protesters in Iraq that killed hundreds of Iraqis. It should be clear to any reasonable person that Soleimani posed a long-term threat to the United States and to innocent civilians in the Middle East and across the globe. We don't need to get into classified details to see Soleimani's clear threat. According to the Department of Defense, in the last 2 months, Soleimani and his proxies launched 12 attacks against U.S. forces and facilities in Iraq. On December 27th, his Iranian proxies killed an American and injured 4 U.S. servicemen near Kirkuk. On December 31st, his Iranian proxies launched an assault on the United States Embassy in Baghdad. But Soleimani was not done. Secretary Pompeo said that Soleimani was, quote, actively plotting to take big action that would put dozens, if not hundreds, of U.S. lives at risk, which DOD said targeted, quote, American diplomats and service members in Iraq and throughout the region. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, said that the administration would have been culpably negligent given the evidence they had in intelligence had they not acted. The president possessed the legal authority for this strike and complied with his obligation to report it to Congress within 48 hours under the War Powers Resolution. The President has inherent Article II authority as Commander-in-Chief to defend the United States personnel from attacks that Soleimani was carrying out and plotting against Americans. It's an act of self-defense. And this is not just a partisan analysis. Jay Johnson, President Obama's general counsel at the Department of Defense and former Secretary of Homeland Security, he's the one who approved the airstrikes during the Obama administration. He said, quote, that Soleimani was a lawful military objective, and the President, under his constitutional authority as Commander-in-Chief, had ample domestic legal authority to take him out without an additional congressional authorization. President Obama's Secretary of Homeland. As a second authority, the National Security Advisor cited the 2002 AUMF that authorized the use of force to, quote, defend the national security of the United States against the continuing threat posed by Iraq. That authorization has been used previously to address terrorist threats to U.S. personnel inside Iraq, including by President Obama, to go after ISIS terrorist forces in Iraq. The dangerously partisan reactions to last week's strike in defense of Americans are even more apparent when compared to Democrat reactions to Obama's thousands of unauthorized airstrikes in defense of Libyans inside Libya in 2011. Back in June of 2011, then Leader Pelosi was asked about Obama administration's months of airstrikes inside Libya, dropping hundreds of millions of dollars in U.S. munitions without congressional authorization. Leader Pelosi was asked, Madam Leader, you're saying that the President did not need authorization initially and still does not need any authorization from Congress on Libya. Her answer was, quote, yes. She said, I believe the limited nature of this engagement allows the President to go forward. I'm satisfied the President has the authority he needs to go ahead. That logic should apply far more in the strike against Soleimani to protect Americans. I'm pleased the administration did not hesitate to take bold action given the high threat level. Soleimani showed us through the embassy attack and the attacks on U.S. forces that he was serious about hurting Americans. Our intelligence community saw his next plan coming together in our military under direction from our Commander-in-Chief acted. They saw the storm coming and they stopped it. I want to thank the President and the men and women of our intelligence community and the military for upholding their responsibility to protect American lives. But instead of supporting the President, unfortunately, my Democrat colleagues are dividing Americans at a critical time, weakening our leverage overseas and emboldening our enemy, the largest state sponsor of terror in the world. With that, I ask my colleagues to oppose this resolution, which seeks to tie the President's hands as he continues to defend Americans in the Middle East, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 5 minutes to the author of this important resolution, the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Slotkin.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you. I rise today in support of my bill, a war powers resolution that states the President of the United States must consult Congress before going to war with Iran. This is simply what our Constitution requires. For me, this is not a theoretical exercise. My husband spent 30 years in the Army, retired as a colonel. We actually met on my third tour in Iraq when I was a CIA officer. My stepdaughter is a brand new Army officer. My son-in-law's unit is stationed at Al-Assad Air Base, which was just targeted by ballistic missiles this week. If our loved ones are going to be sent to fight in any protracted war, the President owes the American public a conversation. The resolution we will be voting on today allows us to start that debate as our founders intended. Let me be clear, The government of Iran is a leading state sponsor of terrorism and engages in a range of destabilizing activities across the Middle East. I have experienced these personally as a former CIA analyst. I served multiple tours on Iraq, 3 tours. My specialty is Iranian-backed Shia militias. I have followed Iran's destabilizing activity in Iraq up close for my entire professional career. I have watched friends and colleagues hurt or killed by Iranian rockets, mortars, and explosive devices. Iranian General Qasem Soleimani was the lead architect of much of Iran's destabilizing activities in the Middle East and throughout the world. To that end, with Iran or with any other adversary, the United States always has the inherent right and obligation to self-defense against imminent armed attacks. Always. And the United States always maintains the right and the responsibility to ensure the safety of our diplomatic personnel and our armed forces serving abroad. But when it comes to the matter of longer-term war, either as something that we choose as a nation or as something that we find ourselves in, as members of this body, we have a constitutional responsibility to authorize the use of military force. The framers of our Constitution rightly believed that the power to declare war belongs in the Congress because this would ensure that the American people, through the legislators they elected, weigh the most significant decision a government can make. To this end, the resolution does a few simple things. First, it states that the President does not currently have authorization for war against Iran, which his own Secretary of Defense acknowledged in a congressional hearing last month. Second, it requires the President to get congressional authorization if he wants to conduct a protracted war with Iran. Third, it makes clear that the President maintains the authority to use force to prevent imminent attacks against the United States or our forces. As someone who has spent her career in national security, it is extremely important to me that this resolution in no way ties the President's hands or takes away any capabilities from our military commanders to respond in self-defense for ourselves and for our allies. We have been at war for nearly 2 decades, which has spanned both Republican and Democratic administrations, as my colleague pointed out. And in that time, Congress has only voted twice to authorize the use of military force, in 2001 and 2002. Congress has long abdicated its responsibility, as laid out in the Constitution, to make the hard decisions we owe our troops when it comes to authorizing war. We owe it to our military and to ourselves as a nation to open this conversation on the authorization of military force, to provide our troops that clarity, and to abide by the Constitution that we have all sworn to protect. I urge my colleagues, Republican and Democrats, to support this resolution. I know it is a political time, but my attempt was to hew very exactly to what our founders intended. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the distinguished Republican leader, Mr. McCarthy.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The United States and our allies are safer with Qasem Soleimani gone. President Trump's decisive leadership was justified, and it was right. Soleimani had the blood of over 600 American service members on his hands. For more than 20 years, he attacked our troops, established a brutal reign of terror across the Middle East, and was directly responsible for the death of thousands of innocent civilians, including in his own country. And he had more terror planned. As President Trump said, this strike was done to prevent a war, not start one. And in yesterday's address, he was true to his word. He was confident and restrained. Even as he underscored our strength and resolve, he extended the people of Iran our hand in peace and friendship. President Trump's decision to embrace the Reagan doctrine of peace through strength in dealing with Iran has worked. Those who criticize President Trump for Iran's dangerous foreign policy should actually spend a few moments and review their history. It is Iran who is responsible for escalating tensions by creating chaos to spread fear and accumulate power. In the decades since 1979's revolution, Iran has become the #1 state sponsor of terrorism in the world. More recently, it shot down an American military drone and seized a British oil tanker. On December 27th, Iranian proxies crossed the line by killing an American. For the first time since 1988, we have an administration willing to strike back. For most of the media reports, many may only know him as an unnamed U.S. contractor killed in Iraq. But he was more than that. His name, Harez Hamed. He was a husband, he was a father of 2 young sons, and he was a resident of California. And before he became a citizen, he was valiantly serving alongside our troops as a linguist. All of our hearts breaks for his wife and children who are left mourning his death. There are some in this chamber that seem to be downplaying his death, but his death matters. It matters to his family, it matters to his countrymen, it matters to the president, and it matters to me. His death was unnecessary, unprovoked, and it deserved justice. That is why my next statement carries even more meaning. Red lines should mean something. In this administration, they do. Killing Narez was a red line. Planning to kill Americans is a red line. I'm confident that the right decision was to take out the man responsible for Narez's death and the death of hundreds of other Americans. Iran responded earlier this week by sending missiles to U.S. bases in Iraq. I believe we are all relieved and grateful that there was no American casualties. Iran appears to be pulling back from its strategy of provocation in the face of firm American determination. They seem to understand that de-escalation is the right time right now for them in the world. Now is the time for our country to come together and speak with one voice, not as Republicans, not as Democrats, but as Americans. But instead of working with this administration to continue work towards shared goals, Democrats are using this moment to continue their hatred towards the president. As my colleague and former CIA officer Will Hurd said, he never thought he would see the day that the Iranian government would be able to manipulate members of Congress, Democratic presidential candidates, and the Western media. Yet here we are on this floor today. If President Trump's instinct is to put America first, his critics' instinct is to blame America first. The words of my Democratic colleagues, including the Speaker of the House, blame the United States for attacks Iran has been initiating for the past 4 decades. Now they want to limit the president's ability to defend America. That's just dangerous. And I want to clear up some news, Madam Speaker, that I actually even recently heard on this floor. I would probably consider it fake news that Democrats have told American people. Contrary to their claim, the resolution before the House today is non-binding. It is called a concurrent resolution. This resolution, if passed, won't go to the President's desk for signature. It won't have the power of law. Madam Speaker, I heard the chairman try to talk and try to claim that this had power. I know we have 3 co-equal branches of government. Madam Speaker, I think the chairman should actually look what the Supreme Court ruled on the Chadha case. That concurrent resolutions are unconstitutional as a means to limit the executive branch. I think I may need to read it twice, so let's do that. In fact, the Supreme Court ruled that in the Chadha case, the concurrent resolutions are unconstitutional as a means to limit the executive branch. The purpose of a concurrent resolution is to deal with mundane housekeeping matters in Congress. Now, I want you to know, so everybody understands, what have we used concurrent resolutions for? Very important to authorize the use of the Capitol grounds for the soapbox derby, to use the rotunda to present a congressional medal to Jack Nicklaus, and to host a birthday party in the Capitol Visitor Center. But the new majority decided to use it for something different. For a party that wants to claim they care about the Constitution, Madam Speaker, Democrats may want to brush up on their facts. If they did, they would realize their actions today are shameful and are embarrassing, even by the low standards they set in their impeachment inquiry. They seem to have forgotten that we are not the House of Resolutions. We're actually the U.S. House of Representatives. Our job isn't to debate feelings. Our job isn't to make recommendations. We're actually elected to have a job is to make law. But that is not how we are spending our time today. This resolution has as much force of law as a New Year's resolution. It is nothing more than a press release to appease their socialist base. But what message is it sending to Iran? That we are strong, determined, and united as a country? Or that we are divided, short-sighted, and weak? Madam Speaker, in war, resolution, and in peace, goodwill. Winston Churchill wrote those words after he led Britain to victory in the Second World War. They describe what he believed were the right actions for great leaders to take at history's defining moment. We should keep Churchill's words in mind today. President Trump clearly has. Because of President Trump's leadership, the United States and our allies are safer today than we were exactly 1 week ago. Petty politics are wrong for the country, especially now. Not liking President Trump is not an excuse for failing to see this president and his administrations have a sensible and deeply American strategy for dealing with Iran. Madam Speaker, I imagine we'll continue to hear from other Democrats defend Iran for their escalation and the death of an American. Madam Speaker, I'll imagine that the Democrats will try to claim a concurrent resolution is more than a soapbox derby, but the Supreme Court says otherwise. Madam Speaker, I imagine I'll hear a lot from the Democrats today. I'd actually like to hear a Democrat speak to the 600 Gold Star families the Soleimani killed. I'd like to hear them defend that. I'd like them to hear to defend Iran and their actions of burning an embassy, of killing an American, of killing thousands of civilians, even in their own country. But they're going to take our time today with something that means nothing. But yes, they will run to the mics, they'll get on TV, and they'll tell a little more fake news that it meant something today. The only thing today will happen, it'll make Iran believe they are stronger. It'll make Iran believe they have allies in the House of Representatives. It is a day that one we will not be proud of. Madam Speaker, in light of the information that we have coming out of Iran, if it is true of why an airline was shot down, if that was the case, I would like to see a Democrat move to the floor and pull this concurrent resolution. If it means nothing, I think we should have all the facts. And I'll look forward to listen to, Madam Speaker, to any Democrat that wants to speak to the Gold Star families about why they want to have a debate today and tell me that Soleimani is bad, but. It's not but, it's because. Because he killed Americans, because he killed thousands of civilians, that is why he was taken out, and the world is safer because of it. Madam Speaker, I look forward to hearing the defense from the other side.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Well, I'm sorry the Republican leader is casting aspersions. I think everyone on both sides of the aisle take this very seriously and have reasons why we're voting the way we're voting. I now yield 1.5 minutes to a gentleman who has been very involved in these issues for a long, long time, has been a real leader in these issues, the gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership. I rise today not as a partisan, but as someone concerned about America's future. We have worked across the aisle with people like Representative Meadows and others to stop our country from getting into endless wars. And there is not one party that wants to stop these wars. This is in our national interest. Now, let's be very clear. Soleimani had blood on his hands. Soleimani is a bad actor. Soleimani killed Americans. That's not the debate. The debate is whether America should get into another war in the Middle East or whether we should be focused on our real competition, which is China. We're 21% of the world's GDP. China, our competition for the 21st century, is 15%. Iran is 0.44% of GDP. China hasn't been in a war since 1979. We're in 40 conflicts. Future historians will ask, why were we so obsessed with a region, the Middle East, 3.5% of GDP, when we should have been focused on investing in our country to build the future to win the 21st century? I don't think staying out of bad wars that cost this country trillions of dollars is a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. Frankly, the president ran on this. And my hope, I know Leader McCarthy says this is a formality. Under the War Powers Act, you're supposed to have a concurrent resolution. My hope is the president will agree with it and not get us into a war in Iran.
Seconds.
Gentleman's recognized.
I appreciate that. I make the final point. I mean, this shouldn't be partisan. Here's what I would love to see, that the president says in future action he's not going to get into a war, and he agrees with the concurrent resolution that this body passes. I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Shabbat.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. I rise today in opposition to this resolution, which curtails the President's authority to protect American interests in the Middle East. 2 weeks ago, Iranian proxies launched a missile attack on American forces in Iraq. This was the 11th such rocket attack by the Iranians in recent months, but this time, as our leader said, it killed Narez Hamid, who was a husband, a father, a contractor, and an American citizen. The man behind this attack and additional attacks that were being planned and that were imminent was the terrorist mastermind, Qasem Soleimani, who was responsible for the deaths, as we've heard, of at least 600, probably many more Americans, and for thousands of others in that part of the world, and for causing destabilization throughout the entire region. For years now, Soleimani had been leading Iran's shadow war against us and against our allies. In targeting Soleimani, President Trump took bold, long overdue action, and he ought to be supported for this decision, not criticized. This resolution, by condemning even limited military force and limited action, would essentially tie the president's hands behind his back as he tries to counter Iran's shadow campaign against us. It makes no sense, this resolution, and I would strongly urge my colleagues to oppose it and vote against it. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
America is not safe or safer because of the acts that occurred local time, January 3rd, 2020. America is in more jeopardy as our brave men and women in the United States military of whom we hold in the highest esteem, and say to their families, we are obligated and committed to, one, honor you and thank you, but to also recognize when we send you into battle, there would and should be the consultation, the engagement, the understanding of the intelligence, and the work between Article 1, the United States Congress, and Article 2, the President of the United States. I will not allow any member of Congress to malign my Gold Star families or to suggest that any member here does not respect the ultimate sacrifice that their family members took. Family members who are Gold Stars should not be used in a political debate. They should only be honored. And I will not accept anyone describing Democrats as mourning terrorists. What I will say...
Additional 15 seconds.
Gentlewoman's recognized.
What I will say is that nothing in this resolution speaks to any named person. It says that this body must adhere, this Congress, to its duty to be able to ensure that the President of the United States does not unilaterally take us into war with Iran. We will not stand for it. And it does as well say that my resolution in
the gentlewoman's time has expired.
Indicated we should not have gone to war in Iraq. I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This week, universally respected Senator Joe Lieberman, a Democrat, provided an extraordinary op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. Quote, President Trump's order to take out Soleimani was morally, constitutionally, and strategically correct. No Americans can dispute that Soleimani created, supported, and directed a network of terrorist organizations that spread havoc in the Middle East. In Syria, more than 500,000 Syrians have died. During the Iraq War, Soleimani oversaw 3 camps in Iran, trained fighters, having killed more than 600 American soldiers. The claim that President Trump had no authority to order this attack without congressional approval is constitutionally untenable and practically senseless. Democrats should leave partisan politics at the water's edge and stand together against Iran and dangerous leaders like Soleimani. End of quote. Senator Joe Lieberman tells the truth. We must resist death to America, death to Israel. Our sympathy to the family of Norez Hamid, an Iraqi-American Muslim from California who was murdered by the Soleimani-financed terrorist 13 days ago. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 1 minute to a valued member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the distinguished chairman. I rise in support of H-Con Res 83, directing the President to cease military hostilities against Iran. Last week, President Trump ordered a provocative and disproportionate drone strike, killing Quds Force Commander Major General Qasem Soleimani. Soleimani was a malign actor who masterminded the killings of many U.S. soldiers, but assassinating him has unleashed the dogs of war. Iran launched a dozen ballistic missiles against 2 U.S. military bases in Iraq, and we must be prepared for further Iranian retaliation. These threats stem from the President's fateful and reckless decision to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal, a deal that was working by every measure, leaving us with no leverage and Iran with nothing to lose. We don't need another war. Peace demands action now. That's why Congress must reassert its solemn constitutional duty under Article 1 to decide when and where the United States goes to war. This resolution does just that. I urge my colleagues to support it. I yield back.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry.
Gentleman's recognized.
I thank the gentleman from Texas. Madam Speaker, this resolution is sincere and unserious. If my colleagues on the other side really want to limit the President's ability to defend the United States, then they ought to take the vote and limit him and stand for that vote. Now, if you're not familiar with terrorist Soleimani, let me just acquaint you. His reign of terror for Americans started with 241 Marines in Beirut, Lebanon. Him and his organization continued on to the Khobar Towers, hundreds and hundreds of Americans dead by IEDs and thousands maimed. People from an individual, a service member from Pennsylvania, incinerated in the vehicle that he was in. Thank you, terrorist Soleimani. The president does not desire war with Iran or anyone else. But Iran has been fighting us since 1979. I got a news flash for everybody. They've been at war with the United States since they punched us in the face in 1979. Washington has been appeasing Iran, and the policy of appeasement has been getting Americans killed since 1979. 542. That's the number of drone attacks under the Obama administration in places like Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan. Oh, by the way, not the theater of war for the United States. Not a peep, Madam Speaker, not a peep from the other side. The terrorist state of Iran cannot continue killing Americans and cannot have a nuclear bomb, Madam Speaker. It's time to stand up for America and Americans, including this president. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 2 minutes to a longtime valued member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman.
The gentleman's recognized.
This resolution imposes extraordinary restrictions on this president, an extraordinary president who needs extraordinary restrictions. This is best exemplified by the president's gratuitous comment that he would hit cultural sites in Iran. Not only is that a war crime, but it's a mistake, because it drives the Iranian people toward the regime while alienating our European allies whose support for our sanctions is critical for them to work. The minority leader came to this floor and says Democrats were dupes of the Islamic Republic. I will compare my record of efforts against the Islamic Republic of Iran with those of any other member. You can argue whether Soleimani's death makes us safer or not over the next few months. We have removed a terrorist mastermind from the battlefield, but we've inspired the other terrorists. But the real issue is the effect on Iran's nuclear program. That program is more robust today than it was a week ago, as Iran has employed more centrifuges and is building a larger stockpile, all without our European friends who are still in the JCPOA taking any action against Iran. There was no policy process on the golf course where the president made this decision. He heard not from a single expert on Iranian politics, religion, or the economy. Our maximum pressure campaign is designed to put such pressure on the Iranian people that they choose not to endure it, but demand that the nuclear program be scaled back or ended, or that the regime that has that program be swept away. This assassination undercuts that effort by building support for the regime and its nuclear program with most of the Iranian people. By making Soleimani a martyr in front of a Shiite population, a Shiite religion that lionizes martyrdom, we increase the likelihood of an Iranian nuclear weapon. I yield back.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from New York, a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Zeldin.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in strong opposition to this resolution. I rise in total support of the decision to remove Qasem Soleimani. I've heard the use of the word disproportionate from the Speaker. I've heard it here today on the House floor. And it's just a shocking word to be used to describe what took place. And it makes me ask the question, at what point is it proportionate to take out a designated terrorist who kills 600 U.S. troops, wounds thousands of others, kills and wounds troops recently, his proxies attack a U.S. embassy, and if anyone has any doubt as to what Qasem Soleimani was doing in Iraq at the time that we took him out, you can look at the IRGC's own words. The IRGC put out a statement saying that Soleimani and companions were on their way to, quote, plan a confrontation against the new scheme of the Americans to rebuild Daesh and the Takfiri groups in order to again disrupt Iraq's security. Who needs an intelligence briefing to determine that this is totally legitimate? On behalf of all of those Gold Star families and all the Blue Star families, of anyone who's deployed now, of anyone who's in harm's way, you need proof? Go to Walter Reed. You need proof? Sit down with some of these Gold Star families who lost their sons, their daughters, their fathers, their mothers, their brothers, and their sisters because of this designated foreign terrorist running a designated foreign terrorist organization who is sanctioned by the United States, by the EU, and by the United Nations. I say good riddance. Why are we having this debate? We should be coming together, not as Republicans first, not as Democrats first. We should be coming together as Americans first and voting this down. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 1.5 minutes to a valued member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Engel. I rise in strong support of this resolution, sponsored by my good friend from Michigan, Congresswoman Slotkin. The Trump administration's foreign policy failures have brought us to the brink of war. The administration has provided no evidence to demonstrate what imminent threat made Qasem Soleimani's assassination and the perilous, predictable fallout necessary. But they have demonstrated a shocking dismissiveness as to what's at stake. On the threat of retaliation from Iran, Secretary Pompeo said, "It may be that there's a little noise here in the interim." President Trump said, "If it happens, it happens." To the parents who are worried sick about their kids serving in the Middle East, it isn't a little noise. Their children's lives are at stake. Those stakes make today's vote necessary. The question before us is simple. Can we let this president drag us into another war that will cost billions of taxpayer dollars and, most importantly, American lives? Will we, at long last, stand up and fulfill our constitutional duty to make decisions on war and peace? I urge my colleagues to vote for this resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentlewoman from Missouri, Ms. Wagner.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
I thank our ranking member. And Madam Speaker, I rise today in strong opposition to the Democrats' dangerous resolution to undermine our national defense and allow unchecked Iranian aggression against the United States and our allies. This resolution intends to cripple our ability to protect American soldiers serving in the Middle East and attempts to forbid the use of force against Iran, even if they are attacking Americans. I am shocked and saddened by the partisanship of this chamber. I was proud when former President Obama succeeded in his decision to kill Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. I am proud that President Trump ended Qasem Soleimani's brutal reign of terror that killed and maimed countless Americans and coalition forces and threatened many more to come. But instead of uniting behind the president's defensive decision to strike one of the world's most powerful terrorists who was organizing attacks against Americans in Iraq, I want entered into the record, Madam Speaker, these pictures from the Military Times of the assault and the burning of our embassy in Baghdad. I would like them entered into the record.
Objection.
Instead, many Democrats are arguing that the American president himself is guilty of aggression and escalation. This, Madam Speaker, is unconscionable. I agree with the president that attacking Americans is never acceptable, and Iran should be held to account. When American lives hang in the balance, Article 2 of the Constitution empowers the president to use force to protect and defend our country. I urge my colleagues to oppose this egregious partisan farce, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 1 minute to a valued member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the chair of the Subcommittee on Europe, Eurasia, Energy, and the Environment, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating.
The gentleman's recognized.
Today we debate much more than the words on parchment that define our congressional responsibility. Long before I knew this legal responsibility, I learned the moral responsibility inherent in what must be the most sober and deliberate decision we can humanly muster. As a young boy, indelibly etched in my mind is the conversation with my grandmother, the day she pulled a box out from underneath her bed, reverently handing me the medals and final belongings of my uncle who was killed in action, and telling me about her lost son. I wondered then what was so important to justify such a loss and what my uncle must have been thinking about. That day carried with me, as I traveled to Iraq, a newly elected congressman, to visit our troops during a time of war. I remembered having a conversation with a young Marine. I asked him his personal thoughts about the goals of the war, what he thought. Did he think it was justified? And he told me, with all due respect, sir, that's your job. My job is to serve. He was right. It's our job. That's why we're debating this, and that's why I'm supporting this resolution. I yield back.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished Republican Conference Chair, Representative Cheney.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Mr. McCall. Madam Speaker, the measure before us is an unconstitutional political stunt meant to undermine the President of the United States. It will not become law, but it will embolden Iran. The Speaker and my colleagues who support this resolution ought to admit to the American people what they are doing. That is undermining United States defense policy towards Iran. Qasem Soleimani, the lead architect and overseer of Iran's web of terror, is dead. This terrorist was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of American service members, the killing of an American citizen in Iraq just 2 weeks ago, and the recent assault against our embassy in Baghdad. He was engaged in planning for further deadly attacks. But the Democrats in this body are so consumed by their hatred of President Trump that they will not even stand with him in support of the killing of the world's deadliest terrorist. Instead, they have suggested a moral equivalence between the United States and Iran. The Speaker of the House even blamed America, describing the killing of Soleimani as, quote, an unnecessary provocation. Madam Speaker, what is a provocation is the introduction of this resolution, which sows doubt about American resolve. It makes war more, not less, likely. I urge my colleagues to stand united as Americans, to put partisan stunts aside, and to oppose this dangerous resolution. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Minnesota, Ms. Omar.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. This administration says starving the Iranian economy is in defense of human rights, when it is an abuse of them. That withdrawal from the nuclear deal was a demonstration of American leadership, when it is an abandonment of it. Escalation is de-escalation. War is peace. In fact, they're asking us to deny reality. The reality is that families of American soldiers and diplomats are being kept awake at night worrying. The Iraqi people who've suffered decades of unjust war are now unjustly suffering as their country becomes a battleground in a proxy war. The Iranian people have suffered because of maximum pressure and will suffer because of this escalation. John Quincy Adams said, "America goes not abroad in search of monsters. America's glory is not dominion, but liberty." This administration has gone abroad in search of monster to destroy. May God show us the way to freedom, independence, and peace. I yield back.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Mast.
Gentleman's recognized.
Make no mistake, Madam Speaker, this resolution is about the killing of Soleimani. He was a terrorist, no different than al-Baghdadi, than Zalkari, than bin Laden, than Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. He was the head of a designated terrorist organization, no different than ISIS or al-Qaeda. And he was responsible for the deaths of our men and women. And I know most in here haven't seen or smelled or touched that kind of death, but let me tell you about it. They were burned alive inside of their Humvees. Their lungs were scorched by the flames of the explosions. The vehicle fragments were blown into their skulls. Some of them were paralyzed. Some of them had their arms blown off. Some of them had their legs blown off. Some of them will never see again. Some of them will never be recognized again by those who knew them previously. Each and every one of them, they are the credible explanation for deleting this terrorist target from our world. And no doubt, it is dangerous to take out a terrorist target. But a coward is somebody who lacks the courage to endure danger. And this is the fundamental difference in voting yes or no here. If you vote no, you understand that we would be justified to kill 100 Soleimanis for just one of our heroes that have been killed by him, and the danger would be worth it. For those who vote yes, they see that he has killed hundreds of our service members, but can still not find the justification to kill him because, unlike our fallen heroes, they lack the courage to endure danger. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 1 minute to a valued member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Trone.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. I rise today in opposition to an unnecessary war with Iran in support of this resolution. Today, the question before us is, are the American people more safe or less safe after the killing of Qasem Soleimani? As a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, I have significant concerns about the administration's inability to answer this question and communicate a coherent strategy to avoid war and keep us safe. The American people have seen no evidence that killing Soleimani was the result of an imminent threat, no evidence of a discernible political plan for our policy toward Iran moving forward. Questions of war and peace are the most fundamental of the issues that come before this Congress. They require deliberate and thoughtful decision-making. This action by the administration was not that. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this resolution. I yield back my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows.
The gentleman's recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I never thought that I would hear on this House floor an apology to the Iranian people for an action that we took that was justified, taking out our terrorists. I cannot believe it. And yet we just heard that on this House floor. We have a gentleman who gave his legs in service to this country, and yet we're apologizing to the Iranians? With a non-binding resolution that is nothing more than a press release, Madam Speaker. It has no effect. It doesn't do anything. In fact, the Supreme Court says that. They know that. All they're doing is trying to get a press release to keep them from having a primary opponent. This is sad, a sad, sad day. And yet here we are having another speech to try to take on the President of the United States for actually taking out a terrorist. I would ask my colleagues opposite, how many Americans does a terrorist have to kill before they join with us? Is 600 not enough? Does it have to be 1,000, 10,000, 1 million? At some point, we have to stand up and let the long arm of justice go in and take out these terrorists. I'm here to tell you today that this non-binding resolution, indeed, they want to talk about their constitutional requirement. Well, check with the Supreme Court. In 1983, they ruled that this has no effect. At least our senators opposite, they know that. It has to be a joint resolution. And yet, what is this vehicle normally designed for? For soapbox derbies. Well, at least that accomplishes something. All this does is emboldens our enemies to suggest that the American people are divided. But I'm here to tell you that we are not divided. We are a safer country because of the actions of this president, the decisive actions of this president and our military. And more importantly than that, this War Powers Act that got passed, it was a message that came out of a difficult time. But I want the message to be clear today. We are standing behind our military men and women. We have their back, and we will not yield.
This time's expired. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you. Let me remind my friend that we too cherish our military and also have their backs. I now yield 1 minute to the chairwoman of the Committee on Oversight and Reform, the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Maloney.
The gentlewoman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of this resolution. Congress has constitutional authority when it comes to one of the most important decisions any of us can make to send our brave men and women of the armed forces into harm's way in service of our country. Recent events demonstrate just how important this congressional role is. When the president decided to strike a high-level Iranian official, he made a decision that was provocative in the strongest sense of the word. And he did that without any meaningful congressional consultation. The information that we have received is woefully insufficient, including the notification and the briefing provided by senior officials yesterday. Congress and the American people have no assurance that the president is acting as part of a well-thought-out strategy that makes Americans safer rather than sets us on a war path. I am deeply opposed to an unauthorized war with Iran. That is why I support this resolution, which reiterates that only Congress can declare war and that we have not done so here, and I yield back.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Rushenthaler.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I oppose this dangerous resolution. Iran has been at war with us for 40 years. They held Americans hostage in Tehran. They murdered our Marines in Beirut. They killed hundreds, if not thousands, of American service members in Iraq. And in recent months, Iran shot down a U.S. drone, they killed an American citizen, and they organized an attack on our embassy. So let's be clear. General Soleimani was the mastermind behind these attacks. Soleimani was in Iraq planning imminent attacks on our service members, our diplomats, and our Iraqi allies. Soleimani was an enemy combatant and a lawful target. As a Navy JAG, I prosecuted terrorists in Iraq. I was actually stationed right across from our embassy in Baghdad. And I witnessed these threats on our own forces. And so I applaud President Trump. I applaud our warfighters. I applaud our intelligence community for reaching an incredible outcome against Iran. Soleimani's death was a win for America, for freedom, and for peace. And in supporting this resolution, Democrats are choosing to stand with their far-left radical base rather than standing up against Iran. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
It's now my pleasure to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Schiff.
The gentleman's recognized.
2 minutes. I'm sorry. 2 minutes.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in support of the resolution. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution grants Congress the power to declare war. This was not a matter of great controversy among the founders, because going to war is the most portentous decision that a nation can make. And in our democracy, it is a decision to be undertaken by the people through the Congress and not by one person. We are all enormously grateful that no U.S. personnel were killed in Iran's missile strikes, and I hope that the President will take advantage of the momentary calm to de-escalate the situation. But we cannot assume peace will hold indefinitely because of the impulsive actions of this President, which have so often brought us to the brink of war. Qasem Soleimani was a malign force responsible for the death of many Americans. But after the briefings I have received, I have no confidence that there is some broad strategy at work. or that the policies of the president are doing anything but increasing the dangers to the American people. That is a recipe for disaster, one which increases the likelihood of stumbling into a war that the American people do not want and Congress has not authorized. The resolution before the House today is a step towards reasserting our constitutional duty to rein in a president whose unilateral actions have isolated us from our allies, increased the risk of a nuclear-armed Iran, and made us less safe. Finally, I hope the vote today is the first of a broader reassertion of Congress's war powers, including the sunset or repeal of the 2001 and 2002 authorizations of military force, which have been stretched beyond recognition. It is past time for Congress to do our job and not simply write the executive a blank check. I urge a yes vote on the resolution and yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Watkins.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I spent somewhere around 8.5 years in conflict environments, post-conflict environments between Iraq and Afghanistan, and in all that time I knew many people who suffered at the hand of Qasem Soleimani. One in particular takes me back to 2006 or 7. I was smoking and joking at the embassy in Baghdad. Shortly thereafter, I was doing so with a friend, really a brother, a West Point classmate, who shortly thereafter went out on a mission, ultimately was killed in a complex attack perpetrated by Qasem Soleimani. I understand that action leads to risk, but inaction leads to more risk in the long run. And when searching for this divine strategy, look to what tactical operators know to be true, and that is when we go throughout our work on the ground with an assault rifle in one hand, a sat phone in the other, we need to know that should anything happen to us, our president's going to have the freedom to rain fire down upon our enemies. So thank you so much, and I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
It's now my pleasure to yield 1 minute to an esteemed member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Espaillat.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in support of the resolution. Without a coherent strategy, such actions as the recent ones that occurred in Iraq present a dangerous move forward for the United States engaging in a war that the American people do not want. Today, we move to reclaim power that the executive branch has tried to usurp from Congress. We assert our constitutional authority to determine if the country are to go to war. And we send a message loud and clear that we do not want to go to war. We will not engage in a reckless hostilities to endanger American lives, American interests, and our American values without fully evaluating imminent threat. And we must continue to assert that without new authorizations from Congress, this administration cannot engage in offensive military actions. That's what our framers intended. Madam Speaker, I yield back the remaining part of my time. Thank you.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, former CIA officer, Mr. Hurd.
The gentleman's recognized.
Madam Speaker, right now is not the time for a partisan exercise that could be used as propaganda by the Ayatollahs. Instead, Congress should be united in condemning a regime that has been attacking America and our allies for 40 years. Qasem Soleimani was the head of the most dangerous and well-armed terrorist organization in the world, and his death has removed a major terrorist leader off the battlefield. This decision followed repeated rocket attacks by Iranian proxies on American forces in an attempt to storm our embassy in Baghdad. This decision was based on intelligence that our chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has described as compelling, imminent, and very clear that Soleimani was planning attacks against our troops. This is an assessment with which I concur. No one wants another war in the Middle East. Instead of tying the hands of our military, we should be sending a strong message to the Iranian regime that there will be consequences for their reign of terror, and we will protect our citizens at all costs. The Iranian regime has killed over 600 American troops in Iraq. They have killed over 1,500 of their own people for peacefully protesting, and they have lied to the world about their nuclear arsenal. Appeasing them will only make future conflict and bloodshed more likely. That's why I wish today, instead of this partisan exercise, that we were sending to the government of Iran a clearer message that no elected official in America is supportive of its behavior. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. DeFazio.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank the chair. Well, President Bush's invasion of Iraq was the worst foreign policy mistake in the history of the United States based on fake intelligence. And President Trump took us to the brink of war with Iran with an impulsive act the end of last week, which would be even more disastrous than the war with Iraq, which is still reverberating throughout the region. Now, some on that side say, oh, you're not with the troops, you're apologizing. No, we're not. We are reasserting the constitutional duty that you're sworn to in this House of Representatives. Congress and only Congress can declare war. Once we have declared war, the President of the United States, as Commander-in-Chief, can conduct it as much as this gentleman could. This is just a step. We need to repeal the authorization for use of military force against Iraq based on fake intelligence, because that was his lawyer's rationalization why they could do this in Iraq, a sovereign nation, without their permission. And we also have to reform the War Powers Act, because the War Powers Act itself does not reflect our constitutional authority. And finally, we have to pass an amendment to prohibit a hostile action against Iran without authority from Congress.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Nebraska, General Bacon.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I oppose this resolution that is designed to embarrass our president in front of the world, and in reality gives comfort to Iran's leadership. It weakens America and emboldens our enemies. This resolution is not needed. The War Powers Act is still in effect, and the president is not conducting combat operations against Iran. He wants de-escalation. He does not want war. He's not doing what President Obama did in Libya. What the president did was a one-time defensive operation when he targeted General Soleimani. And let us be clear, Soleimani murdered 609 Americans in Iraq. His proxies attacked our embassy. The Quds force he commanded shed blood across the world. He even attempted terrorism right here in Washington, D.C. He was the #1 threat to Israel, and he was anti-Semitism personified. I knew who Soleimani was when I was in Iraq. We were targeted by rockets every single day from Iranian proxies, trained in, funded by, and armed by Iran, and sometimes led by Iranian commanders, and fellow Americans died. The targeting of Soleimani is justice for the 609 families who had a son or daughter murdered by this guy, and the thousands missing an arm or a leg because of his savagery. In bringing up this resolution, the Speaker said our targeting of Soleimani was disproportionate. It's disgusting. This guy killed 609 Americans in Iraq alone. He was the mastermind. Does it take 100 more, 200 more, or 300 more? It's vile. Our strike was also defensive. General Milley said he saw some of the best intelligence he's ever seen, and that it clearly showed Soleimani was in Baghdad planning an imminent attack on Americans. To deny this is to call General Milley a liar. This resolution weakens America and gives hope to the Ayatollah that we don't have the resolve to stand up to these attacks. A house divided will not stand. I pray wise leadership prevails, that we unify to oppose Iranian terror that murdered hundreds of our fellow citizens. I yield.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 1 minute to a gentlewoman who has worked very hard on these issues for many years, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lee.
Gentlewoman's recognized.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the chairman for yielding and also for your tremendous leadership. Madam Speaker, I rise in strong support of H-Con Res 83. This critical resolution helps put a check on this administration's reckless and irrational, unauthorized military actions against Iran. The American people do not want, and we cannot allow, another unnecessary war of choice in the Middle East. This resolution is an important step in our efforts to prevent that from happening. This will restore our constitutional duty over military action. Also, we must take up my bill, H.R. 2456, and repeal the 2002 AUMF and Congressman Khanna's bill to prohibit any funds for a war with Iran absent an explicit authorization. My 2002 AUMF was included with bipartisan support in the House, passed in 2020, the NDAA bill, but it was stripped by Republicans from the final bill. Now I know why. Madam Speaker, this administration has falsely claimed that the 2002 AUMF could be used as a congressional authorization to attack Iran, which is completely outrageous. Let me be clear. U.S. military deployment and operations carried out pursuant to the 2002 AUMF.
Another 15 seconds.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The 2002 AUMF, it officially concluded in 2011. Maintaining this authorization is not only dangerous, but it's irresponsible. Madam Speaker, it's past time to return to diplomacy and end these endless wars. I urge an aye vote on HCON Resolution 3. Thank you again.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Mississippi, a Marine veteran of the Persian Gulf War and current member of the Mississippi National Guard, Mr. Palazzo.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Speaker, I rise today in strong opposition to this resolution. Let's be clear with the American people. Democrats wrote this bill before being briefed by senior intelligence officials on the strike that eliminated Soleimani, a well-known terrorist. At the end of the day, we all know that this man was responsible for the death of thousands of individuals, including over 600 American service members. President Trump was absolutely right to respond and acted within his constitutional authority to protect American citizens. He owes no one an apology. Feelings can be healed, but dead Americans cannot be resurrected. My question for those on the other side of the aisle who are hell-bent on undermining this president over political differences is how many more Americans did you want to die before President Trump acted? Let's reflect. President Obama authorized over 540 drone strikes, killing over 3,700 people and more than 320 civilians. Not a single one was authorized by Congress. As a veteran and a member of our United States military, I am ashamed at the behavior I am witnessing now. Our military deserves better, and so do the American people. During a time where our country should unite behind our commander-in-chief, this resolution turns us against ourselves. I support our men and women in uniform and hope my colleagues on the left will come to their senses to do the same. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
This is Lou. I now yield 1 minute to a distinguished member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Liu.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Engel, for your leadership. I previously served on active duty in the United States military, and if we're going to put our troops in harm's way, we better have a strategy. Unfortunately, we don't have a strategy from the Trump administration. We just have reckless and impulsive decision-making by the president. Let me just ask a very simple question. What are our goals with Iran? Is it to get them to come back to the negotiating table on the nuclear program? Well, we're further away from that goal now because they've announced they're no longer going to abide by limits on their nuclear program. Or is the goal to get their regime to collapse? We're further from that goal, too, because the Iranian people who previously were protesting their government are now rallying behind their leadership. Or is the goal to work with our allies to contain Iran? Well, we're further away from that goal, too, because the Iraqi parliament just voted to kick us out of their country. We are less safe now than we were a week ago. Vote yes on this bipartisan resolution. I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Duncan.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, many of the senior leadership on the other side of the aisle voted for the 2002 AUMF on Iraq, including the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the majority leader, and the chairman of Intel. The AUMF in 2002 gave this president every bit of authority he needed to go after a terrorist in Iraq. In fact, the terrorist that he killed, Soleimani, was designated under Barack Obama Executive Order 13224 as a specially designated global terrorist in 2011. Where was the outrage when President Obama was using the same AUMF as justification for dropping bombs in countries like Yemen or Syria, or violating the sovereign airspace of Pakistan, which we all agreed with, but violated the airspace of Pakistan to go in and kill Osama bin Laden? We were fine with that. This is a specially designated global terrorist who deserved the death after he was responsible for 600+ American deaths. This is an atrocious
The gentleman's time's expired.
act, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Massey.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Speaker, there's 2 times we're going to be called to account for our votes here in Congress. One is at our next election. The other is when we draw our last breath of air. I'm more concerned about the latter myself. This vote isn't about supporting or opposing President Trump. I voted for President Trump. I plan to vote for President Trump again. This vote is about exercising our constitutional authority, but more importantly, our moral obligation to decide when and where our troops are going to be asked to give their lives. Congress needs to do more of what we're doing here today. We need to debate our involvement in Afghanistan, and then we need to bring our troops home. We need to debate our involvement in Iraq, and then we need to bring our troops home. And we certainly don't need another war. And if we do go to war, it needs to be with the blessing and the support of the people and a mission that our soldiers can accomplish. And we do that by following the vision of our founding fathers. We debate it here on the floor of the House. That's what this resolution is about. I urge my colleagues to vote yes, and I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished Republican whip, Mr. Scalise.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank my colleague from Texas for yielding. And I rise in strong opposition to this resolution. And if you look at what they're attempting to do, there's been a lot of talk about the 2002 AUMF, Madam Speaker. And I'm sure, as Congress has over the years, we'll continue to have a healthy debate over what that proper role should be of Congress as it relates to the 2002 AUMF. But that's not what this debate is about. When you read the resolution, in fact, just by its own name, this is not an act of Congress. This isn't even changing the law. And so if you want to have a sincere debate over what that power should be that Congress gave to the executive branch, then let's have that debate. But don't try to pass some fig leaf resolution that is only intended to try to undermine the president in the middle of a conflict with the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, Iran. There's no dispute about how bad of an evil terrorist Soleimani was. But yet you hear all of these equivocations. Oh, Soleimani was a bad person, but how can you sit here and try to apologize for the things that he did by saying taking him out was wrong? This world is a safer place with Soleimani gone. And if you want to apologize to anybody, go apologize to the families of those hundreds of men and women in our uniform who are dead at the hands of Soleimani. Not only the people who he had already killed, but the people who he, at the very time of his death, was plotting to kill even more Americans. How much is enough? At what point do we say, take him off the face of this planet so he can't kill more innocent people? That's what was ultimately done. We support President Trump in his efforts at keeping America safe, just like we supported President Obama when he took out Osama bin Laden, another evil terrorist who had the blood of thousands of Americans on his hands. If we're going to be serious about keeping this country safe, absolutely there's a role for Congress to play, but you've got to support the efforts of your Commander-in-Chief to carry out his constitutional duty, which he has to keep this country safe. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
It's now my pleasure to yield 1 magic minute to our Speaker of the House, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Pelosi.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I thank him for his leadership in bringing this important opportunity for us to express our concern about the President's actions. I salute him, and I thank the support on the other side of the aisle for this legislation. As we know, last week the Trump administration conducted a provocative and disproportionate military airstrike targeting high-level Iranian military officials, and he did so without consulting Congress. When I first heard from the administration, the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, I said, why did you not consult Congress in this change in approach? And they said, because we had to keep this close. We had to keep this close. You had to keep it close from the Gang of Eight, the leadership of the Congress. And we had to keep it close because we didn't want the word to get out. Well, we deserve the respect from the administration, and the Congress deserves, by dint of the Constitution, the requirement of the administration to consult with Congress. We know full well, better than many in the administration, the importance of classified information. We know that we are supposed to support sources and methods. We also know that the consultation that they would give to us does not enable us to divulge any information. So who are they keeping it close from? They admitted, this administration, they were keeping it close from the Congress of the United States. And they did so. Now they did a classified presentation yesterday, which their own party members, Republican senators, said it was the most demeaning and worst classified briefing that they had had. I myself think there's stiff competition for that designation of worst presentation by this administration in a classified briefing. But all of that to say is the Constitution of the United States calls for there to be cooperation when we decide about initiating hostilities. Congress has the right to declare war. When do you decide that it is war? When do you decide it's just hostilities? When does that all end? What line do you cross? But with the President's actions last week, he endangered our servicemen and women, our diplomats, and others by taking a serious risk of escalation with tensions with Iran. This does not come with any respect for Iran. We know what bad actors they are in the world. We know that Soleimani, I from my intelligence background know that Soleimani was somebody that we do not mourn the loss of, he did very evil things in the world. But we also know that when we take an action, we have to understand the ramifications of it. Others could have taken Soleimani out. Israel could have taken Soleimani out. But they didn't. So that's happened. That's where it is. As we go forward, it was really important for us to address the parameters of the War Powers Act, and that is what we are doing here today. The members of Congress have serious and urgent concerns about the administration's decision to engage, I use the term decision loosely, to engage in hostilities against Iran, and it's about a lack of strategy. What is the strategy to move forward? Again, I did not consult with Congress. They gave a presentation that by their own side of the aisle has been described as demeaning and the worst. And then they tell members to go read the classified documents. Classified. Why are these documents classified? Why can't the American people know? We understand redaction of sources and methods and the rest, but if you read that document, you would know there is no reason for it to be classified. And in the, without going into any substantive matters of what happened yesterday in the classified briefing, it's fair to say that we were told, members were told, to go read other documents, which are redacted and, in many cases, classified unnecessarily. Our concerns were not addressed by the President's insufficient war powers authorization, which was classified in its entirety, leaving the Congress and the public in the dark about our national security. And our concerns were not addressed by the administration's briefing yesterday. Today, to honor our duty to keep the American people safe, that is our first responsibility, to protect and defend. We must keep the American people safe. The House will pass a war powers resolution to limit the President's military actions regarding Iran. Congress is reassuring our long-established oversight responsibilities as we mandate that if no further congressional action is taken, the administration's military hostilities with regard to Iran must end. We salute Congresswoman Slotkin for her leadership in this resolution. She's a former CIA and Department of Defense analyst specializing in Shia militias who served multiple tours in the region under both Democratic and Republican presidents. It's important to note, because I heard the distinguished whip on the other side of the aisle say, how come it's just a concurrent resolution? It is because under the War Powers Act, that is one of the options that is provided. You can do a joint resolution, House resolution, or you can do a concurrent resolution. The value and the beauty and the exquisite nature of a concurrent resolution is that it does not have to be signed by the President of the United States. The Congress of the United States, in its full power and full voice, can speak in a united way about what the War Powers Act should look like. And that should count for something to our colleagues who serve in the Congress of the United States. And so under the authority of the War Powers Act that gives us this option, we take this opportunity to do so. I implore the administration to work with Congress to advance immediate, effective de-escalatory strategy that prevents further violence. I also salute this resolution because it does give opportunity for the administration to act under certain circumstances, which are part of the War Powers Act. Madam Speaker, on December, a group of us in a bipartisan way, we traveled to Belgium and Luxembourg to observe the 75th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge. Some of our colleagues on both sides of the aisle had family members who served in that battle. One of ours, Annie Custer, her father, served in that, and she has letters from him at that time, and others, members on both sides of the aisle. Mr. Moulton, Seth Moulton, his grandfather served in the Battle of the Bulge, but also on the Republican side of the aisle, in the House and in the Senate. And why I bring it up is this, because that Battle of the Bulge was a decisive battle in World War II. It was a surprise attack, really, by the Germans. It was a bloody battle. We lost 19,000 Americans, 19,000 Americans in that Battle of the Bulge. When I was listening to the description of it on the days that we were there from the veterans who served, it sounded almost like Washington crossing the Delaware, because it was December, as it was in the United States at the beginning of our fight for independence. Their supplies were insufficient. The camouflage for snow was not adequate. Our veterans, our men then, men in uniform were exposed, nurses too. And it was a triumph that decided, it was very decisive in World War II. And why I bring it up is because when there was the observance of it, with 3 days, parts of 3 days we were there for it, but the close of it, there was a ceremony that included a speech by the King of Belgium, the Grand Duke of Luxembourg, two of the places where this all took place, the President of Germany, who spoke beautifully about Germany now, and saying when you freed Luxembourg and Belgium, you also freed the Germans. What a beautiful statement. But the close of it was from a veteran who served in the Battle of the Bulge in his 90s, was a teenager in the war. We saw the foxholes in which they fought. They lost their comrades in arms. He talked about the brotherhood, and he talked about the allies, and he talked about the fight. And at the end of the speech, the veteran said, "I don't know if I should say this, but I will. My message to all of you is pray for peace. Pray for peace. That's what we should be doing, is moving toward peace, not escalation of hostilities, where that can be avoided. Not because we believe that the other side has good motivations, or that Soleimani was not a bad person. It's not because of what they are. It's because of who we are as Americans. A country that is committed to peace and security and prepared to protect and defend. As President Kennedy said, fight any fight, fight any foe, pay any price to keep the American people safe. But to not be frivolous and cavalier about how we decide to show strength when it really is more of an escalation than a de-escalation. So it's sad, because you would think that any time we would engage in such an important change in approach, that we would be working together, consulting together, respecting the approach that each side takes to all of this, and hopefully just be on one side of it all. So I think this is a very important, it doesn't do everything, but you say, well, it doesn't do this, it doesn't do that. We should never be judging legislation necessarily for what it doesn't do, but respecting it for what it does do. And what this does is very important for the security of our country. I urge a yes vote and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Alabama, the ranking member of the Homeland Security Committee, Mr. Rogers.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the ranking member. I rise in strong opposition to this brazen political stunt. Qasem Soleimani was a vicious terrorist who built a cult following on the backs of dead Americans. He armed Hezbollah, KH, and other Iranian proxies who killed American troops and our allies throughout the Middle East. The Homeland Security and Defense Departments have kept close watch on his terror campaigns for years. Soleimani was not visiting Baghdad because it was a great holiday destination. He was there to meet the leader of a terrorist group that killed an American just days before. Our president used the law and his constitutional authority as commander-in-chief to eliminate this terrorist mastermind before he could kill again. Democrats immediately responded by doubting our intelligence and dismissing the expertise of our military leaders. Now they bring this resolution to the floor that maligns our president, undermines our national security, and makes a martyr of a man who killed nearly 600 Americans. I urge a no vote and yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 2 minutes to the Majority Whip, the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Clyburn.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Thank you very much, and I thank my friend for yielding their time. Speaking out against the Vietnam War in 1967, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. implored, we must move past indecision to action. We must find new ways to speak for peace. If we do not act, we shall surely be dragged down the long, dark, and shameful corridors of time, reserved for those who possess power without compassion, might without morality, and strength without sight. Dr. King's words are just as apropos today. President Trump, in ordering a significant military strike against authorization without seeking authorization or even consultation with the Congress, has brought us to the brink of war. The Constitution of this great country gives the solemn power to declare war to the people's representatives in Congress, not one person in the White House, whoever that might be. With this resolution, Congress is acting to uphold our constitutional responsibility. If the President believes military action against Iran is warranted, this resolution and the Constitution require him to make the case to Congress and receive authorization. Mr. Speaker, I truly regret that we find ourselves in the position we are today. The Trump administration's policy toward Iran, abandoning the nuclear deal rather than building on it while escalating tensions instead, is an unwise application of American power, might, and strength. The strike against General Soleimani, a bad man who no American mourns, drags us closer to another long, dark, and shameful corridor to an unnecessary war. I urge the adoption of the resolution, and I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our Constitution is clear that only Congress can start a war, but only the President can wage it. Congress started this war with the AUMF in 2002. It's still in effect. The founders didn't want one individual getting us into a war, but once in it, they didn't want 535 squabbling prima donnas second-guessing every decision on the battlefield. President Trump needed no other reason to order the attack that killed Soleimani in Iraq beyond the simple fact that he was acting as an enemy combatant against U.S. forces in a war zone in which the Congress had authorized the President to take military action. Now, I happen to believe the AUMF was a colossal mistake. But this resolution doesn't correct that mistake. It compounds it by deliberately undermining the position of the United States government and the armed forces that we sent to Iraq at a perilous moment, which makes it not only unconstitutional, but disgraceful. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the Vice Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the Chair of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Castro.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the last few days, the American people have been unwillingly taken to the brink of war at the direction of this administration. Through reckless actions, the White House has unified the Iranian public, alienated our partners in Iraq and Europe, undermined the fight against ISIS, and left the United States more isolated than before, all in just 1 week and without the consent of this Congress. This is a grave and serious moment in our country. 2 days ago, our brave men and women in uniform came under fire from 22 Iranian missiles in harm's way because of their commander-in-chief. Every American owes a debt of gratitude to our military for its courage and sacrifice. For that reason, a decision that risks troops' well-being must only be made thoughtfully and with the informed consent of the public and this Congress. As a member of Congress, my biggest priority is to protect the safety of the American people at home and abroad. This can only be done by defending Congress's constitutional authority over declaring war. And for that reason, I urge us to support this resolution.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Abraham.
Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
Major Ronald Culver Jr., Corporal Justin Mixon, Sergeant Joseph Richard III, Sergeant Terrell Gilmore, Staff Sergeant Jared Fontenot, Corporal William Crouch, Private Mark Graham, Staff Sergeant Ronnie Sanders, Staff Sergeant Jared McMillan, Sergeant Joshua Winton, Sergeant Ty Guthrow, Private Joshua Burrows, Corporal Joseph Duras, Lance Corporal John Bowman, Lance Corporal John Hale, Sergeant Matthew Westman, Sergeant First Class Terry Wallace, Sergeant Burry Testers, Lance Corporal Derek Cottom, Staff Sergeant Brian Lewis, Sergeant Julian Atkins, Sergeant William Partridge, Corporal David Stewart.
Additional 30 seconds.
Additional 30 seconds is granted.
Sergeant David Murray, First Sergeant Michael Bordelon, Sergeant Nicholas Oliver. Sergeant Seth Trahan. Staff Sergeant Jonathan Reed. Staff Sergeant Christopher Ramsey. Sergeant Michael Evans. Sergeant Robert Sweeney. Staff Sergeant William Manuel. And Mr. Chairman, I request unanimous consent to enter the rest of my testimony into the record.
Without objection. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 1 minute to a valued member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Houlihan.
Gentlewoman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the resolution before us today. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution states, quote, Congress shall have the power to declare war, end quote. The founders were unequivocal. Only Congress has the power to authorize acts of war. Today, we bring forth this resolution to honor our founding fathers' vision for our country, for our government, one whose very survival hinges on the separation of powers and each branch's respect for the other's authority. At this moment, we as a Congress have an opportunity to pursue de-escalatory actions that protect the lives of our armed forces, diplomats, and civilians. And I implore the President and this administration to work with this Congress in this effort. Today marks this first step. We must aggressively pursue diplomacy so that no lives are lost. I encourage all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join in that pursuit. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution. I urge a yes vote. I yield back.
The gentleman's reserves, gentleman from New York reserves, gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you to the ranking member, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of a president who carried out his oath of office. I'm afraid the reason we are here today, again, is out of pure opposition to this president and not the serious national security issues at hand. Make no mistake, terrorist Soleimani is responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Americans, including those that my friend and colleague Ralph Abraham just read. Hundreds of Americans. And he was plotting to kill many more. The President used his full legal authority to take defensive action and eliminate this brutal terrorist. The world is safer today because of it. In times like these, we need to come together as a country and stand behind our men and women in uniform. Whoever occupies the White House should have the ability to direct and address threats and prevent American bloodshed. Just 48 hours ago, Iran attacked U.S. military personnel, and yet we are hastily voting on this partisan resolution that will weaken national security. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this political show resolution, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserves, gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Capter.
Gentlewoman from Ohio is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding and rise in support of the War Powers Resolution as an original co-sponsor. This is a grave and pivotal moment in American history, and we must be greatly concerned for the security of our troops and the safety of the American people. We live in an era of hybrid warfare and high-intensity reaction. One reckless military strike can incentivize countermeasures, not just in the immediate region, but thousands of miles away by Iran's proxies. Wise use of force matters. Without congressional authorization and in defiance of our Constitution, this president ordered an unprecedented strike on Iran's top generals. There is no doubt Soleimani was a fierce enemy of liberty. However, this Lone Ranger attack by the president risks all-out war, greater instability in Iraq and Iran, losing the edge we have gained at such great cost. And some of those names have been put on the record today. We must protect against further attacks on our service members and attacks on U.S. assets wherever they might exist. Might I have an additional 15 seconds?
Gentlewoman, I request additional 15 seconds for the gentlewoman.
Gentleman may proceed.
Thank you. To those ends, the American people deserve full transparency. The President must take steps to de-escalate this highly volatile situation in the most ungovernable part of the world. Let us rigorously pursue with our allies turning back Iran's development of nuclear weapons, and let us do all we can to uphold our beloved Constitution, put raging bulls back in their cages, and make the American people safer. I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from the great state of Texas, Mr. Arrington.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I thank my friend and fellow Texan ranking member, Mr. McCall, for his strong leadership. Mr. Speaker, it's one thing to weaponize impeachment to discredit the president. It's a whole nother thing to handcuff our commander-in-chief and jeopardize the safety of our soldiers and prevent them from defending themselves. Thankfully, this is a partisan resolution that's going nowhere, but it's also disturbing insight into the naive and impotent ideology of appeasement that invited Russia into Syria, created ISIS in Iraq, and emboldened Iran to terrorize and brutally murder throughout the Middle East. This is not a resolution. This is a retreat, a de facto apology. But for what? For ridding the world of a brutal terrorist with American blood on his hands? If this resolution were to become law, Mr. Speaker, it would be a death warrant, and not for the worst of terrorists, but for the best of Americans, our sons and daughters on the battlefield who would be left defenseless, sitting ducks for a murderous mob of mullahs in Iran and Iranian-backed militias throughout the region. I urge a no vote, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky.
The gentlewoman from Illinois is recognized.
It is past time for Congress to exert our authority over the questions of war and peace, and I am proud to vote for this concurrent resolution to invoke the War Powers Act in order to restrain this reckless president. This vote would halt military operations and force the president to come to Congress to authorize any further acts of war. The president remarkably said all is well. Well, Mr. President, it is not well. Iran announced that it would withdraw from the nuclear agreement and will begin to resume its nuclear weapons plan. The United States has been forced to stop its actions against ISIS. Iraq is likely to expel the United States from its country, fulfilling what has been a dream, actually, of Soleimani. Our European allies are angry because they were not alerted, and our actions have united the people of Iraq against us. And Iran are together now. Mr. President, America is not safer because of what you've done, and we must pass this resolution.
Members are reminded to direct their marks to the chair. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I continue to reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
It's now my pleasure to yield a magic minute. Those magic minutes are wonderful. To the Majority Leader of the House, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Let us hope that demagoguery will not play too great a part in the consideration of this piece of legislation. I just heard one of my colleagues on the other side mischaracterize the position of my party and of this resolution. This resolution is the law. This resolution is consistent with not only the law, the War Powers Act, but the Constitution of the United States. And I want to thank Representative Slotkin for authoring this resolution, as well as Chairman Smith, Chairman Engel, Representative Khanna, Representative Lee, and others who have been working hard to ensure that Congress maintains its role as a co-equal branch of government when it comes to matters of war and peace. This president, as we have seen, has consistently treated the legislative branch as inferior to the executive. Sadly, Mr. Speaker, we've had numerous votes on this floor last year to stand up for the co-equal status of the Congress of the United States. And too often our Republican friends have sided with the executive department, diminishing the authority and the position of the Congress of the United States. This is not about this president, nor is it about shrinking from confronting terrorism and terrorists. Again and again, we have seen this president ignore Congress's directives on appropriations, including by shifting money away from the military to fund his costly and ineffective border wars. He has refused to disperse emergency funding for disaster relief that Congress allocated to help the people of Puerto Rico and other places where Americans are in need of help. And he withheld congressionally appropriated funding to help Ukraine repel Russian terrorism. After criticizing his predecessor for the use of executive orders, President Trump has doubled down on using them to circumvent the will of Congress and the American people. All this resolution is say, Mr. President, obey the law. Obey the Constitution of the United States of America, which gives to the Congress the sole authority to declare war. And if you read the language of the resolution, it continues to say that we are for certainly defending any of our people at risk, period. The War Powers Act provides for that. Article 2 of the Constitution provides for that. But the President has ignored congressional subpoenas for documents and testimony directing subordinates to build a wall of obstruction unseen in our history. It should therefore be no surprise that we representatives of the 320 million plus people of America who expect us to be their voice in this critical issue of declaring war. And this resolution does not prohibit in any way the President of the United States, under his Article 2 powers, acting to defend our military, our allies, and our homeland. Now, with the actions taken last week, he is unilaterally moving us toward an involvement in another deadly and destabilizing war in the Middle East. Now, I'm glad, very frankly, that, as we all are, that the response that came from Iran was either ineffective or meant to be simply a message. I don't know which. Thankfully, however, the Congress has under law and our Constitution a remedy to reassert our position as a co-equal branch, as a matter of fact, an Article 1 branch, ensure, as the founders intended, that only the Congress, speaking on behalf of all of the people, could declare war. Congress passed the War Powers Act in 1973 because they believed a Democratic president, and it was a Democratic Congress that adopted the War Powers Act, because they believed a Democratic president had overstepped the bounds. Congress passed the War Powers Act in 1973, determined to ensure that no president can send our troops into war without the people's representatives authoring it. I suggest to my friends on both sides of the aisle, that is what the founders intended. We must use this tool of congressional power, or by our silence acquiesce to the growth of the imperial presidency, which, by the way, has been going on for some 40 years, maybe even 50 years, irrespective of who is president. This is not a partisan resolution. This is a resolution consistent with the Constitution of the United States of America, who did not want a single person to be able to take America to war, to put our men and women at risk. Let us be absolutely clear. Qasem Soleimani was a dangerous purveyor of terror and violence and a practice thereof. He was an architect of Iranian efforts to dominate the Middle East through aggression and fear. He has American blood on his hands as well as the blood of our allies. He has met the justice he deserves. I say that notwithstanding the fact I do not know from the information I have received whether or not, in fact, it was absolutely essential to take his life now because of imminent danger. Perhaps it was. But in any event, no one laments the loss of Soleimani's life, at least in this country and freedom-loving people throughout the world. And we are relieved that the Iranian counterstrike was limited and caused no American or Allied casualties. But, Mr. Speaker, my constituents and the American people are deeply concerned about what comes next, with a possibility of further retaliation and escalation from Iran or its proxies. There may be a time when such action is called for. But it is this body that needs to make that decision, and the United States Senate. This body. It continues. Iran is a dangerous enemy of freedom and a sponsor of terror. It continues to harbor ambitions of dominance over its neighbors and to call for the destruction of Israel. This Iranian regime is no friend and must not be trusted. Iran must never be allowed to acquire a nuclear weapon. I believe this Congress would vote to ensure that that was prohibited. This resolution makes those facts clear. We must have a sound, long-term strategy to deal with Iran and bring it into compliance with international laws and norms. The threat of military force must continue to be a part of any strategy, along with sanctions and diplomacy. And this resolution in no way countervenes that premise. The best way forward is for Congress and the administration to work together. That's what our founders had in mind. Proper congressional oversight and involvement will help ensure, not undermine, that the administration adopts and pursues the best possible strategy to check and oppose Iran's malign ambitions. Let us not demagogue one another. There can be differences. But this resolution is brought to this floor of the House to uphold the Constitution of the United States of America and to again urge this president, as we have urged Democratic presidents, to ensure that they follow the strictures of our Constitution on behalf of the safety of our people and the respect we have throughout the world. We're a nation of laws. This resolution is about the laws. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Let me say I have great respect for the leader, and I do not disagree with him that the president needs to come to Congress to authorize war with Iran. But that is not what we were looking at here today. We do not currently have troops engaged in hostility in Iran, subject to withdrawal under the War Powers Resolution. However, if the administration were to strike Iran directly, in my opinion, they would need to submit a War Powers notification, and they would also need to proceed with an authorized use of military force. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Spano.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Ranking Member McCall. I oppose this resolution. The Speaker claims that it is a necessary response to President Trump's, quote, disproportionate attack on a high-level Iranian military official. Disproportionate. Apparently, Democrats have forgotten who Qasem Soleimani was, one of the worst perpetrators of terror in recent history. He led the organization that founded Hezbollah, one of the most violent terrorist groups opposing Israel. He directed his groups to kill over 600 American service members in Iraq and wound thousands more. He led a brutal attack on peaceful protesters recently in Iran, killing over 1,000 Iranians. A bully will not stand down unless he knows you are willing to stand toe-to-toe with him, unless he knows there are consequences to his actions. And President Trump acted decisively in bringing down this brutal, inhumane bully, this terrorist mastermind, to stop an imminent threat. It was necessary to show Iran we will no longer tolerate their aggression. We should be united in our support for eliminating this threat and in supporting the President's efforts to negotiate a new, more effective Iran deal. And I urge my colleagues to oppose this resolution so that all options are on the table and we can negotiate from a position of strength toward achieving a peaceful solution. I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Eshoo.
Gentlewoman from California is recognized.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of this concurrent resolution, which requires President Trump to immediately terminate military operations against Iran. It's about time that Congress exercised its War Powers Act, powers authority under the Constitution. I believe this is long overdue. Now, the President has taken our nation to the brink of war without properly consulting Congress or seeking the legal authority to do so. Only Congress can authorize military action under Article 1 of the Constitution. And to add insult to injury, the Trump administration has failed to fully explain to Congress and the American people what exactly the imminent threat was to the United States that required the strike that was undertaken. My constituents and people across the country have been terrified about the prospect of a new war in the Middle East. Now, let me be clear. No member of Congress carries a brief for Soleimani or the Iranian government.
I yield the gentlewoman an extra 15 seconds.
I thank the gentleman. But no president has unilateral authority to take our nation to war without authorization from Congress. I urge my colleagues to vote yes.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
I thank the ranking member. Mr. Speaker, if it were but a matter of offering 3 cheers for the legislative branch, that would be fine. But this is dangerous and simply makes no sense. If the majority wished to assert Congress's authority, as several have argued, it would not use a non-binding resolution. But let me take the majority at its chosen words, as if binding. The words of the resolution would literally prohibit the President from ordering the shoot-down of Iranian ballistic missiles inbound for Haifa, or a surface-to-air missile locked onto a Ukrainian airliner. And the resolution's chosen words, as Democrats argue them, would prevent the President from the strike on Soleimani itself, even if devastating harm to American soldiers were imminent. But Democrats second-guessed that judgment. The language you have chosen is designed to debilitate the president from protecting Americans. The intemperate words of the past week have cost many their credibility. Now, Democrats' spite for President Trump has cost them their good judgment. I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Davis.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I voted against the 2002 AUMF. In coming to that very difficult decision, I learned an important lesson, that we must ask every administration that seeks to use military force, how will it manage the consequences of its actions, even if those actions can be justified? Has this administration done that? Unfortunately, I think the answer is no. I will vote for this resolution today for the same reasons I have been. No overall strategy, no justification, and nobody in this administration can answer how it will respond to the aftermath. By virtue of the power and the responsibility granted to us by the Constitution, we must ask those questions. Let's take this opportunity to make diplomacy work. Let's stand together as the Congress to establish our authority. Let's stand together and vote against a new war without an endgame. I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Abraham.
Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
Sergeant First Class Kurt Como, Sergeant Christopher Babin, Sergeant Bradley Bergeron, Sergeant Huey Fassbender, Sergeant Armand Fricke, Sergeant Warren Murphy, Sergeant Craig Nelson, First Lieutenant Christopher Warnett, Private First Class Tory Dantzler, Private First Class James Lambert, Sergeant Taft Williams. I want to thank the ranking member, Chairman McCall, for giving me additional time to finish the list that I started earlier. These are 44 young Americans that died from Louisiana by IEDs in the most active part of Iraq when Soleimani and his proxies were engaged. They designed, they built, and they implemented these IEDs. And in Louisiana alone, 44 young Americans gave their lives for the United States of America. President Trump, he had the authority, he has the right, and thankfully he had the courage to terminate Soleimani and remove this cancer from this earth. And to my Democratic colleagues and friends, I say, if you can look these Gold Star families in the face and tell them that this was not a justified strike and that Soleimani needed to be removed from this earth, then God have mercy on you. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to a valued member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Malinowski.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we may be relieved that an impulsive act by President Trump has not immediately led to war with Iran. We may be relieved that an evil man is dead. But as that evil man wished, our troops have now been asked to leave Iraq, and if they stay, their ability to work with Iraqis to fight ISIS has been shot. As he wished, the protest movement in Iran and Iraq that threatened the Iranian regime has been silenced. As he wished, Iran is now breaking free of all restrictions on its nuclear program. We are not safer today. And in this moment of danger, there is just one question that this resolution asks. Not do you support what the president has already done, but should Congress play our constitutional role in deciding what happens next? I support this resolution because passing it will protect us against going to war with a tweet, but it also ensures that if we do go to war, which we may have to at some point, we will do so with the American people united, not divided, as the framers intended, as our national interest demands. I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I continue to reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Cisneros.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in defense of our Constitution and express the urgent need of Congress to reestablish itself as an equal branch of government. Our founders explicitly laid out the roles and responsibilities of the legislative, executive, and judiciary branches, creating a necessary system of checks and balances. But today we find our democratic system in jeopardy. In the past week, there has been an increasing concern about the United States going to war with Iran. Let me be very clear. If and when the President decides to use military action, he must go through Congress first. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war. Any attempt to undermine the power would be unsafe, unacceptable, and unconstitutional. As a Navy veteran, I am constantly thinking of our brave service members. It's why I take this constitutional responsibility seriously. We cannot turn our backs to our principles, we cannot turn our backs to our values, and we cannot turn our backs to the Constitution. I look forward to voting for the War Powers Resolution and taking Congress's power back. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves, and the gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and my good friend. I rise with great frustration in opposition to this politically motivated resolution. It is nothing but a blatant attempt to handcuff the President's ability to defend our citizens and our allies. Just this morning, U.S. intelligence officials reported that they are now confident that the Ukraine airline 752 was shot down by Iranian surface-to-air missiles. Another 176 innocent lives lost. The Islamic Republic of Iran has been hostile to our nation for decades, and yet it has certainly escalated in the last several months with a campaign of antagonistic military action. Have my Democratic colleagues forgotten about the shipping vessels sabotaged by naval mines last May and June, or the American drone shot down over international waters, or the British oil tanker seized by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, or the Saudi oil facilities that were attacked? And then when an American citizen was killed in an attack on Kirkuk Air Base in December, and our embassy in Iraq subsequently overrun, our president drew a line in the sand. Yet after months of tremendous restraint, the president was determined that not one more American life would be lost at this Iranian regime, and I fully support the president in his actions. I do agree with many of my colleagues that it's time for this body to have a serious conversation and to address the many issues inherent with operating under a 20-plus-year-old authorization for military force, but that should not be confused with the process that's taking place here with this resolution. This is nothing but another attempt by the majority. 15.
Be happy to yield an additional 30 seconds.
Gentleman may continue.
Thank you. This is nothing but an attempt by the majority in a 3-year-long process by their party to take any and every opportunity to undermine or embarrass this president. But be assured that this politically motivated resolution, nor any evil that comes our way, will cause our president to hesitate when called upon to defend American lives. And I just say, God bless the president, God bless America, and with that I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Well, I would say to my friends on the other side of the aisle, please don't question our motives or patriotism, and we won't question yours. I now yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Jayapal.
The gentlewoman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of this resolution that reasserts congressional authority over going to war. We know this: war is devastating for our troops, for their families, for families and children everywhere, for not just this generation, but future generations to come, for our humanity. And that is why our framers gave this body the opportunity, the responsibility to have that discussion and declare war should it be needed. In 2002, we rushed to war based on made-up claims of weapons of mass destruction, and that Iraq war and Afghanistan wars took hundreds of thousands of lives, created millions of refugees, and cost us trillions of dollars. Today, the President, without providing any raw intelligence to prove an imminent threat, has brought us to the brink of war with Iran. So this resolution makes it clear that Congress has not authorized this war. We also must repeal the 2002 AUMF and vote to withhold funds for this unauthorized war. It is time to reassert our authority. I yield back.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I continue to reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib.
The gentlewoman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today on behalf of 13 District Strong. This is a district that believes in leading with compassion. They believe in a full stop to endless violent wars that only result in loss of life and the destruction of lives forever changed. For us, Mr. Speaker, it is important to protect our democracy and promote global peace. We must remove political motives and for-profit schemes from the decision-making process to go to war. If we don't, it would only lead to more warfare and death. We cannot allow a process that is tainted, secretive, or encompasses lies to make that choice. We need a country that easily chooses peace for generations to come. I proudly represent a district that believes in the rule of law. That is why I rise today as their voice in support of a war powers resolution that will give them a say in whether or not our country goes to war. Thank you.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Green.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in complete opposition to this resolution. First, this is a non-binding resolution. If you really wanted to exert some congressional decision-making, we'd do a bill that goes before the president and gets signed or gets vetoed. This is purely theatrics. None of these Democrat leaders stood up when President Obama violated the airspace of Pakistan to take out Osama bin Laden. Now, I'm glad he did that. But he violated, there was no congressional authorization to go into Pakistan. At least here, there's a congressional authorization for our forces to be on the ground and using military power. The President has clear authority under Article 2 to act when our nation and our military is at risk. The Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said, and I quote, "The trigger for the drone strike that killed Soleimani was clear, unambiguous intelligence indicating a significant campaign of violence against the United States in the days, weeks, and months, and that the administration would have been culpably negligent if it didn't act." General Mark Milley, these people understand one thing, and it's strength. You'll recall that when President Clinton pulled our forces out of Somalia after we got the black eye on Black Hawk Down, bin Laden cited that as proof that the Americans run away, that they won't stand and fight. I've been to combat 3 times in this region of the world, twice in Iraq and once in Afghanistan. I've looked these individuals in the eye. It's strength that they understand, and clearly it's shown itself to be true again. This president stood up, and Iran's response was clear. They had 2 audiences in their response. At home, they wanted people to see strength. They shot 15 missiles. They're back in their press saying they killed Americans. They didn't, of course. The other audience, the United States and the rest of the world, they fired 16 missiles. All 16 missed. All 16 missiles missed. Remember, when they hit Saudi Arabia, all those missiles hit. They know how to hit their target. They fired 16 missiles against us and not a one hit. What's the message they're saying? Immediately after they fired them, they stood up and said, "We're done. No more, that's the end of our response." They told the Shia militia groups to stand down. And Muqtada al-Sadr said to his people today, stand down. They respond to strength. And our president did the right thing. He was a strong response to storming sovereign U.S. territory of an embassy with 6,000 people, killing American contractors and wounding American soldiers with a rocket attack. Mr. Speaker, this president made a strong response, and it's shown itself to work. I yield.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you. I just can't really believe what I just heard. It was the 2001 AUMF specifically authorized our going after Osama bin Laden. He's the example of Congress getting involved. That was the authorization to get Osama bin Laden in Pakistan or any place else. And that's what we're trying to assure here, that things aren't just happening, that there is actual authority. And Osama bin Laden is the wrong example because we gave the authority to go after him. I yield 1 minute to a gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Frankel.
Gentlewoman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the mother of a United States Marine War veteran, I came to Congress with the promise of never sending someone else's child to a war that could be avoided. This War Powers Resolution says no war with Iran without congressional approval, while still ensuring defense if there's an imminent threat. While we do not mourn the death of Iran's commander of terror, Americans and our allies worry about the ramifications will make us less safe. The fight against ISIS has been diverted. Regional protests against the Iranian regime are now against America. Iranian proxies have been further incited, and Iran is closer to having a nuclear weapon. America is not a monarchy. The decision to go to war requires debate, deliberation, and collective judgment. That's why the law gives the responsibility to Congress. I urge support of this resolution, and I yield back.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this point, I'll continue to reserve until Chairman Engel is prepared to close.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend, Mr. Engel, for yielding. I'm troubled by aspects of this debate. I think it's fine that we have different views. But to hear some on the other side characterize the position of those who support this resolution as somehow not loving the country as much as they do, when it's our country as well that we pledge to defend. It's the same veterans on this side of the aisle that put themselves in harm's way as the veterans on the other side of the aisle. There's no distinction in the battlefield. We love our children and want to defend them as much as we know you do as well. So let's stop the demagoguery regarding patriotism. This comes to a simple question, and it's not even a question as to whether or not there was justification to take out Mr. Soleimani, because clearly there was. The question is who gives the justification, who authorizes military action in this country. We can all have our opinions, but we ought to consult the Constitution that vests.
Yield the gentleman 15 additional seconds.
Gentleman may continue.
Thank you. We ought to consult the Constitution, which clearly vests that authority in this Congress. We ought not fear that authority and outsource it to the executive branch. We ought to embrace that authority and be willing to make that decision and follow the Constitution. I thank the gentleman.
The gentleman from Texas continue to reserve. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton.
The gentlewoman from the District of Columbia is recognized.
I thank my good friend for yielding. Congress has long been absent without leave from its constitutional responsibility to authorize war before it occurs. From Vietnam to Iran, the verdict on the War Powers Act is clear. You lose it if you do not use it. Congress chafes at outside presidential power, but has failed to exercise its own advice and consent power on war. Iran has stepped back for now from the brink of war following the killing of General Soleimani. But a strong bipartisan 69% of the American people say that war with Iran is now more likely. No wonder, considering that we have just deployed 15,000 more troops to the region. Trying to get answers after the fact, as Congress did in yesterday's briefing, yielded frustration, not answers. Unchecked executive power unbalances the safeguards against arbitrary power the framers built into our Constitution. With passage of today's resolution, we will reclaim that balance by reinserting Congress into decisions to go to war.
The gentleman from Texas, continue to reserve. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Okay. I now yield 1 minute to a very valued member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the chairman of the Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and International Terrorism, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Deutsch.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this War Powers resolution, and I thank my colleague from Michigan, Representative Slotkin, for leading this effort today to assert Congress's rightful authority and to defend our solemn constitutional duty. None of us want to see our brave men and women sent into another war. To be clear, this vote is not about telling the administration that the president can't defend this country. My colleagues know that. They understand it. I strongly reject any implication that somehow by supporting this resolution, we don't take our national security and the safety of our service members seriously. To the contrary, nothing we do today limits the ability to respond to a real and imminent threat or defend this country and our interests. To assert so is simply false, and it is reckless. Today we're telling the president that if there is a serious threat to the United States, our national security requires that a solemn decision is made to engage U.S. forces. The elected representatives of this body have to have.
The gentleman may continue.
I thank my friend. The elected representatives of the American people need to have that case made to them. Congress needs to have a robust debate about any authorization for the use of military force. I urge my colleagues to vote yes. I urge my colleagues to uphold the Constitution, and I yield back.
Does the gentleman from Texas continue to reserve? Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Getz.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
I take a backseat to no member of this body when it comes to defending the president. This resolution offers no criticism of the president, no critique. It doesn't criticize the president's attack on Soleimani. Matter of fact, this resolution doesn't even say Soleimani's name in it. Yet it does articulate our very robust basis for self-defense, at times even preemptory self-defense to defend our troops. And it also articulates our non-delegable duty as members of the United States Congress to speak to matters of war and peace. I represent more troops than any other member of this body. I buried one of them earlier today at Arlington. And that sergeant died a patriot and a hero. If the members of our armed services have the courage to go and fight and die in these wars, as Congress, we ought to have the courage to vote for them or against them. And I think it's ludicrous to suggest that we are impairing the troops from doing their job by not doing our job articulated in the Constitution to speak to these matters of war and peace. I support the president. Killing Soleimani was the right decision, but engaging in another forever war in the Middle East would be the wrong decision, and that's why I'm voting for this resolution. And I yield back.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Does the gentleman from Texas continue to reserve? The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the system of checks and balances is broken. Last week's airstrike proves it. After the strike, the administration produced a vague document that attempts justifying America's push to the brink of war. Mr. Chairman, I fought in a war started by a president with false and trumped-up intelligence. We cannot let this president do the same. Americans deserve to read the declassified report so they can judge for themselves whether the strike was worth the risk. They'll find an administration shooting from the hip with no strategy to deal with Iran. It's time for Congress to lead and exercise the authority the founders gave us in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. It's time to tell the President he cannot send our troops to war with Iran without a strategy and without the consent of their representatives. I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. Does the gentleman from Texas continue to reserve? The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Brown.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. President Trump's strategy to counter Iran has failed. He has allowed Iran to restart its nuclear weapons program, disrupted our operations countering ISIS, continues to undermine our relationship with NATO allies, and has led America to the brink of a new and unnecessary war. As someone who served in Iraq, I understand the costs of war, how our soldiers put their lives on the line, and the impact these decisions have on military families. Our founders entrusted Congress with the responsibility to declare war. Congress owes it to the American people and our men and women in uniform to carry out that responsibility. It's time for Congress to declare that war with Iran is not in the best interests of the American people. It is time for Congress to repeal the 2002 AUMF and dramatically restrict the 2001 AUMF. And until we can do that, we must prevent the President from unilaterally committing the United States to yet another war in the Middle East. And I yield back.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Does the gentleman from Texas continue to reserve?
No, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the chairman. I was sitting in my office and watching this debate, and I began to wonder who it is that we're actually debating against, or what it is that we're debating against. And I think back to the killing of Osama bin Laden, when we stood together as a United States and saying this was the right thing to do at the right time because it would save lives. The only thing we regret is that we didn't do it sooner when we had a chance to take him out. But we delayed because we weren't sure. I've gone back and read what President Obama said, and he says, I made this decision on my own. Yet today we stand in the people's house, and we're worried more about the loss of an election in 2020 than the loss of American lives and the continued loss of lives around the world by one of the worst terrorists of all time. And we sit here and try to pretend this charade is what we're really concerned about, is giving too much power to this president. This is a president who acts boldly. This is a president who carried out a strike that was so precise, so strategic, nothing else was hurt except the car in which that terrorist was riding in. And yet we sit here today and say, our problem in America isn't terrorists around the world. Our problem is in America is we have a president who's too damn strong. The rest of the world knows today that our enemies certainly do fear us because they know there's a deterrent in the White House. And our friends and allies know that America will always be there. We'll always be there if we say we're going to be there, and we will always stand up for the values that this country has always stood for. To have this debate tonight and this resolution is not about securing America or making America safer. This is about taking powers away from the President of the United States. And we can call this anything we want to say, not just this president, but any president in the future. My God, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? This, the people's house, and our biggest responsibility is protecting our American citizens. And we're having this debate tonight. Please do not tell me this is about taking away the authorization for military force. This is about taking away powers from the most strong president we've had. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
You know, again, I think it would be helpful if people's motives or patriotism wasn't questioned. I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schneider.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of the War Powers Resolution introduced by my colleague from Michigan, Congresswoman Alyssa Slotkin. Soleimani was an evil man, a terrorist, a war criminal. No one should mourn his demise. But that doesn't change the question of who has the authority to take our nation into war. It is Congress, and only Congress, that is endowed with the most solemn duty to decide if, when, and where to commit our nation to war. At the same time, as Commander-in-Chief, it is incumbent upon our President to ensure that the fine men and women who serve in our military are only sent into harm's way after careful deliberation and tasked with missions that protect and further America's interests and reflect the values and high moral standing of our nation. Our country's founders, in their foresight, provided us a robust and resilient constitutional republic and representative government. They wisely understood that taking a nation to war should not be a unilateral decision by a single person, but a considered decision by the people's elected representatives. This administration does not have congressional authorization for use of military force or a declaration of war against Iran. Ultimately, any sustained action against Iran requires congressional approval. Today's resolution reflects the intentions of our founders. It makes clear the President must seek authorization from Congress for any extended military engagement with Iran without restricting his ability to protect the nation from imminent threat. I have the honor of representing Naval Station Great Lakes, where every enlisted sailor receives his or her basic training. I am the proud father of a son serving in our Navy. We owe it to these Americans, each one a volunteer answering the call to serve our country, to protect this Constitution and live up to the expectations of our founders. The American people do not want an unnecessary war with Iran. Today's resolution prevents President Trump from unilaterally or impulsively starting one. I urge my colleagues to vote yes. I yield back.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Wisconsin, a man who served on the battlefield in Iraq.
Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It takes a lot to get me to come down to these things, but I have been deeply troubled by some of the rhetoric I've been hearing about this. In fact, I was deeply troubled after yesterday when my colleagues, many of them left a classified briefing only to immediately and recklessly trash the quality of intelligence they received, and in some cases suggest there was no imminent threat from Soleimani. To suggest that would require you to ignore the death of Americans recently in Iraq, as well as ignore the history of Soleimani's campaign of terror across the Middle East. And we learned this weekend, while this body was still in recess, and before anyone had reviewed any of the classified information, that it was the intention of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to introduce this flawed War Powers resolution without having even seen any of the underlying intelligence. This suggests that this is not a serious effort.
Additional 30 seconds.
Gentleman may continue.
This is not a serious effort. This is a political effort that will have the practical effect only of undermining our military deterrent in the Middle East, which for the first time in a long time is actually stronger. And I think this does a service not only to our personnel in the region, but ultimately to the Iranian people. And what the Iranian regime fears more than anything else, more than the American military and the President of the United States, is its own people. And that is the reason Soleimani's death squads have gunned down Iranian civilians in the streets. And we look forward to the day when the Iranian people can be free of their evil, barbarous, reckless regime, and I applaud the administration's actions.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
May I inquire how much time I have?
and has 4 minutes remaining.
4 minutes. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Crow.
Gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, our founders vested in Congress the solemn responsibility of sending our sons and daughters to war. I have often heard folks say that now is not the time to discuss the use of force or decision to send our men and women to fight. I heard that in 2003 when I was carrying a rifle in Baghdad. I heard it again in 2004 and 2005 when I was leading my unit through the mountains of Afghanistan. And I am hearing it again today in the halls of Congress. In the last 19 years, more than 7,000 Americans have given their lives in these conflicts. 53,000 have been wounded, and we have spent over $4 trillion of taxpayer money. Do not believe the fear-mongering. This resolution does nothing to prevent the President from protecting the nation against imminent threats. I have spent years fighting to keep Americans safe and will continue to do so. I may have laid down my rifle, but my oath to this country endures. I will fight to ensure that we are having a discussion about when to send our men and women, our sons and daughters, and our sisters and brothers into harm's way. It is time to have this debate. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this point, I'm continue to reserve until the chairman is prepared to close.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
For a minute if you want. I now yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
What I say? 30 seconds. 1 minute, I think. We'll start talking. I'll give you a hit.
Thank you, sir. I rise today to condemn the President's most recent reckless actions. The killing of General Soleimani was a provocation to war that made Americans less safe for years and maybe decades to come. The President has put his own ego over the strategic interest and safety of Americans. What he has accomplished with these actions is to make Soleimani a martyr for a generation of militant Middle Eastern foes that we have. It has united the Iranian people not against their government, but against us. It is the responsibility of the President.
Gentleman, additional 30 seconds.
The gentleman may continue.
It's the responsibility of the President and Congress to keep us safe. And the Founding Fathers knew that the collective wisdom of the people's representatives was better at doing that than one person. I just visited the SCIF, and there is still not any report on any imminent danger claim that might have been made. The American people and Congress deserve to know what the threat allegedly was, given the inevitability of Iranian retaliation. The two greatest powers Congress has is impeachment and declarations of war. We are here today on both of those issues because of a reckless, lawless, and impetuous President. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the President. Does the gentleman from Texas continue to reserve? The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 1 minute to very distinguished gentleman from the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Meeks of New York.
And for how much time?
1 minute.
Okay. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
The President should not be able to commit the U.S. recklessly and flagrantly to war. That is the reason there are constitutional mandated checks and balances. The President escalated hostilities with Iran and did not demonstrate any imminent threat nor strategy as to why. He clearly did not make our country safer, quite the opposite. It is not a sign of strength, as some of my colleagues suggest. It was an unchecked sign of more disarray and lack of strategic thinking. We have seen what happens when we don't have a plan for what comes next, when we take out a bad actor without thinking through long-term consequences. We have lost too much blood and tears and treasure to ever allow that to happen again. I support and employ my colleagues to support this resolution for the sake and the state of future generations. I love this country. This is the greatest country in the world because we have checks and balances. I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I continue to reserve my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Yeah, I reserve my right to close.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now recognize Mr. Berde for 30 seconds.
Gentleman from West Virginia is recognized. Indiana is recognized.
Thank you. And Mr. Speaker, just got a couple of words I'd like to remind this body about. And I've heard a lot of talk about patriotism. And I gave this arm in Vietnam. And I've got a lot of good friends whose names are on the Vietnam Wall. So don't talk to me about patriotism and how much I love this country when we're standing here debating an issue that we all know is not going anywhere. And the last thing I would say to you is while I was serving in Vietnam, there were many occasions when I didn't have the ability to do what I thought was necessary. I'd just say to you that this body couldn't make up their mind whether they wanted to be in that war or not. And I suggest we get with the right program and do it now. Thank you.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Speaker, I'm prepared to close. And I yield myself the balance.
Gentleman is recognized.
Speaker, I'm strongly in favor of exercising our Article I authorities for matter as grave as war and peace. But the fact is we are not at war with Iran, and the President is not trying to start a war with Iran. I met with the President earlier today. He told me that if this resolution passes, it will take all of his power to negotiate with Iran off the table. And that is the worst thing that we could do. Yesterday, he called for making a deal that allows for Iran to thrive and prosper. The President is making the choice to move towards de-escalation. The premise of this resolution is flawed because we are not engaged in hostilities with Iran. The President is not trying to start hostilities with Iran. And despite this public proclamation by our President, my colleagues are trying to claim that the President still wants to go to war. I deeply regret that my colleagues are not serious enough about exercising our Article I authorities to pursue regular order on such a serious question. We have had no hearings in the House Foreign Affairs Committee since these events transpired. There was no Foreign Affairs Committee markup of this legislation. I received text of this legislation only 2 hours before the Rules Committee meeting last night on a war powers resolution. Debating issues of war and peace is perhaps our most important responsibility as members of Congress, and yet this legislation dropped last night without committee consideration as required by the War Powers Resolution. If my colleagues were serious about Article I, as they say they are, this would be a joint resolution with the force of law. Instead, it is a House concurrent resolution that will never go to the President's desk. Let me translate what that means for the American people listening today. Today, we are voting on a press release, a press statement. This is a political statement for a left-wing domestic audience. But they are not the only ones watching, Mr. Speaker. Iran is watching, and its proxies are watching. And what they see is a divided America that does not fully support the ability of our commander-in-chief to respond to imminent threats to Americans. Churchill warned against appeasement when the dark clouds of fascism and the Third Reich swept in my father's war. Weakness invites aggression, he said. And as President Reagan said, peace through strength. I believe in these ideals and these axioms. And last May it was reported that Soleimani met with Iraqi militias in Baghdad and told them to, quote, prepare the proxies for war. Prepare for the proxy war. Without last week's strike, Soleimani would still be waging that proxy war, a war that he was escalating. An American was killed less than 2 weeks ago, and 4 American soldiers were injured. and our embassy in Baghdad was attacked under Soleimani's orders. What more do we need? What more evidence do we need? And let's talk about the fact he's a designated terrorist under the Obama administration. Importantly, the president told me today that Soleimani was planning to blow up our embassy. I need no further proof or evidence than that, or intelligence than that from the President of the United States. And what if the president had not acted? Let's assume that. What if the president had, and by the way, some on the other side of the aisle were criticizing him for not responding after our embassy was attacked. What if he did not act? What if Soleimani made it back to Tehran to meet with the Ayatollah, to give the green light to carry out the plot to attack our soldiers and diplomats in Iraq? What if the Americans were killed? What if they killed our soldiers and diplomats? What if they successfully stormed our American embassy and held our Marines and diplomats hostage like they did in 1979 when this whole reign of terror started with Jimmy Carter in the White House? How would the critics of the president respond then if we had done nothing? How would America, the American people, respond? How would the Gold Star mothers respond? No, the president, this president, did the right thing to take out this threat that killed so many Americans. I've been to too many funerals, and many of us in this chamber have. And many of those soldiers were killed at the bloody hands of Soleimani. And so, those many Americans whose families still grieve today, we grieve for them. And since 1979, Iran has presided over a reign of terror in the region, and for over 2 decades, Soleimani has been the mastermind of terror, and the world is safer today without him. And let me just conclude by saying, now is not the time. Now is not the time to divide this nation and play into the propaganda of Iran. Now is the time not to tie our commander-in-chief's hands. Now is the time to support our men and women in uniform. And with that, I urge my colleagues to oppose this resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this body has to make a decision about whether we're going to stand up for our constitutional responsibilities or just subordinate ourselves to the executive branch when it comes to war powers. We're 2 decades into the 21st century. Our country has been at war almost that entire time. Not a day goes by that I don't wish we could have some of those decisions back, especially because we see those measures we passed in 2001 and 2002 are still being used to justify sending American men and women into harm's way. We could stand here all day and say, well, your side let this happen when you were in charge, or you didn't say anything when this president did that. I don't disagree. It's been a collective failure on the part of this body that we've given away our authority on war powers, that we haven't done enough to grapple with the issue. Well, I hope today will not be the end of our efforts to make progress on debating Congress's war powers. If the president thinks he needs to use military force, he needs to come to Congress and make the case and let us vote on it. I urge my friends on both sides of the aisle, support this resolution. This is the beginning of Congress taking back its authority. Thank you.
The gentleman from New York yields back the balance of his time. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Rule 781, the previous question is ordered on the concurrent resolution as amended. The question is on adoption of the concurrent resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. No. The ayes have it. The concurrent resolution is agreed to.
Okay.
And the yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20, this 15-minute vote on adoption of the House Concurrent Resolution 83 will be followed by a 5-minute vote on the motion to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 5078. This is a 15-minute vote. Sorry. Yeah.
So you're voting.
Oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
And the House voting now on the non-binding War Powers Resolution. It would direct the president to restrict the use of military force against Iran. One Democrat who has voiced his opposition, Max Rose of New York, he's an Army combat veteran who says he doesn't want to play politics with questions of war and peace. This is the second round of votes today. One more vote expected after this one.